Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The Throat of Andros. The camera lay on the sand like a discarded eye, its waterproof casing still slick with the residue of salt and panic, its lens recording nothing now but the relentless advance of a tropical tide that seemed almost eager to reclaim the device. But the memory card within had already witnessed what human eyes were never meant to see, and it was that footage, that single, terrible minute of frantic, silent testimony, that would eventually bring the pieces together, though by then it would be far too late for anyone to change what had happened beneath the surface of the water. The hand in the footage belonged to Eric Vance, though no one watching the grainy, shuddering image would have known that, would have recognized the thick fingers with their bitten nails and the faded scar across the knuckles that he had earned in a laboratory accident 7 years prior. All the viewer would see was a hand scrubbing desperately at a piece of driftwood, working a thick, iridescent blue slime across the bleached grain of the wood, with a violence that suggested either madness or a need to remove something that could not be allowed to remain. The breathing was the only soundtrack, heavy and ragged, the sound of lungs that had forgotten how to function properly, that had been pushed beyond their capacity for oxygen, and were now operating on pure adrenaline and terror. And beneath that breathing, almost subliminal at first but unmistakable once the ear tuned to it, was the thumping. It was rhythmic, massive, the sound of something impossibly large moving with terrible purpose beneath the shoreline, each impact sending a vibration through the sand that the camera's microphone picked up as a low, resonant boom, like the heartbeat of an island that had finally awakened from a sleep older than human memory. Eric Vance had not started that morning intending to become a monster's prey. He had started it, in fact, with the same sense of resigned purpose that had characterized every morning of his professional life since the debacle that had ended his career as a marine biologist. The Bahamas incident, that was how he thought of it, always with that definite article, as if it were a singular event that could be compartmentalized and filed away, rather than the slow-motion collapse of everything he had built over 15 years of rigorous study and obsessive fieldwork. He had seen something in the waters off the tongue of the ocean, something that the peer-reviewed journals had dismissed as a trick of light and pressure-induced hallucination, and he had made the fatal error of believing his own instruments over the comfortable consensus of his colleagues. The papers had been retracted. The grants had dried up. The university had offered him a choice between a quiet resignation and a very public termination. And Eric, who had never been good at theater, had chosen the former and retreated to a rented bungalow in Key Largo, where he spent his days identifying fish specimens for tourist diving companies, and his nights staring at the ceiling fan, while the ghosts of his ambition rotated above him in endless, mocking circles. The call from Marcus Whitfield had come on a Tuesday, which Eric would later remember because Tuesdays had become indistinguishable from every other day of the week, interchangeable blocks of humid inertia that blended together into a smear of purposeless time. Marcus had not introduced himself as a venture capitalist, though that was what he was. He had introduced himself as a collector of anomalies, a phrase that should have sent Eric running for the door, but instead had awakened something in his chest that he had thought the Bahamas had killed forever. Marcus spoke with the polished cadence of a man who had spent decades convincing other people to give him money. But beneath the corporate veneer, there was an edge of genuine obsession, a hunger that Eric recognized because he had seen it in the mirror during the years when he had still believed that the ocean was hiding answers rather than simply hiding monsters. Marcus had read the retracted papers. He had studied the disputed footage. He had hired independent analysts to review the data that Eric's department had declared contaminated, and he believed. He used that word with a fervor that bordered on religious conviction, that Eric had been right about what he had seen in the deep water. "I don't care about your reputation," Marcus had said, the words coming through the phone line with the clarity of a man who had never needed to care about his own. I care about results. I care about finding things that the rest of the world is too timid to look for. And I think you care about that too, Dr. Vance. I think you care about it more than you've let yourself admit since they took your lab away. The expedition, Marcus explained, was already funded. The permits were secured through channels that Eric didn't ask about and probably didn't want to understand. The target was a blue hole on the eastern coast of Andros Island, one of the hundreds of submarine caves that punctured the limestone shelf of the Bahamas like teeth in an ancient jaw. But this one was different. Satellite imagery, thermal, multispectral, synthetic aperture radar, had detected what Marcus described only as a structure at a depth of 240 feet, a geometric regularity that could not be explained by natural limestone formation. The local fishermen wouldn't go near it. The few divers who had explored its upper chambers spoke of currents that ran in impossible directions and sounds that seemed to originate from inside their own skulls rather than from any external source. Marcus wanted to be the first to reach the bottom. He wanted to document what was waiting there. And he wanted Eric Vance to be the one who made sense of it, who gave it a name and a taxonomy and a place in the catalog of human knowledge. Eric had agreed because he was 43 years old and he could not bear the thought of spending the rest of his life wondering what he had been too broken to pursue. He told himself that it was science, that it was redemption, that it was the chance to prove that he had been right all along about the anomalies in the deep water. He did not tell himself that it was suicide by curiosity, that some part of him had been looking for an ending ever since the retraction notice had appeared in the journal, and his colleagues had stopped returning his calls. He packed his equipment with the mechanical efficiency of a man preparing for execution rather than expedition, and he flew to Nassau 3 days later to meet the rest of the team that Marcus had assembled. The team was small and carefully selected, though Eric suspected that carefully selected in Marcus's vocabulary meant willing to sign the liability waivers without asking too many questions. There were 2 dive masters, both veterans of cave diving in the Yucatan and the Floridian aquifer systems. David Chen was a compact man in his late 30s with the calm, assessing eyes of someone who had learned to measure risk in breaths and barometric pressure, rather than in the abstract probabilities that occupied land dwellers. He had mapped portions of the Sac-Acton system that no human eye had seen for 10,000 years, and he moved through the world with the economical grace of someone who had long ago accepted that the only thing between him and death on any given day was his own competence. His partner, Rafael Ortiz, was younger and louder, a Dominican expatriate who told elaborate stories about dives gone wrong in bars after the tanks were hung up, but whose hands were steady on a regulator, and whose instincts in zero-visibility water were rumored to be almost supernatural. They had worked together for 8 years, and the ease of their communication, the abbreviated gestures, the shared vocabulary of looks and nods, spoke of a partnership that had been forged in places where speech was impossible and trust was everything. The local guide was a man named Joseph Roll, born and raised in the settlement of Fresh Creek on Andros' western shore. He was 60 years old, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that seemed to have absorbed so much sunlight over the decades that they had begun to glow with their own internal luminescence. He knew the blue holes of Andros the way a man knows the scars on his own body, and he had agreed to take the team to the site that Marcus had identified only after Marcus had offered him what Joseph privately described as more money than sense. But there had been conditions. Joseph would pilot the boat. Joseph would monitor the surface. Joseph would not, under any circumstances, enter the water. When Marcus had pressed him on this point, suggesting that the old man's experience would be invaluable in the depths, Joseph had simply shaken his head and said, in the musical cadence of the Bahamian dialect that he had never fully shed, "Some doors open only one way, Mr. Whitfield, and some things that live in the dark don't care for company. I will take you to the place. I will watch for you to come back, but I will not go down into that throat. That water has been drinking men longer than my grandfather's grandfather was born." Marcus had accepted these terms with the shrug of a man accustomed to paying for other people's superstitions. But Eric had watched Joseph's face during the negotiations, and had seen something there that made his stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the motion of the boat. The old man was not afraid in the way that tourists were afraid of sharks or jellyfish, with a fear that could be educated away with statistics and reassurance. Joseph was afraid in the way that a man who has seen something is afraid, the way that a soldier who has survived an ambush is afraid of the particular quality of silence that precedes the explosion. It was a learned fear, an earned fear, and Eric recognized it because he had begun to feel something similar stirring in his own chest ever since Marcus had shown him the satellite imagery of the structure at the bottom of the hole. The boat was a 28-foot center console, sturdy and well-maintained, with a hull that had been painted the bright turquoise that the local fishermen favored for reasons that had more to do with tradition than visibility. They loaded it at dawn on the fourth day after Eric's arrival, the sky still streaked with the violent pinks and oranges of a tropical sunrise that seemed to Eric to be warning them away with its beauty, rather than welcoming them to the day's work. The equipment was extensive and expensive. Twin sets of rebreathers for the primary divers, with backup open-circuit systems clipped to their harnesses, powerful primary lights with redundant battery packs, spools of guideline in bright orange that would be their lifeline through the labyrinthine passages of the cave system, and Marcus's contribution, a pair of high-definition video cameras in waterproof housing that he handled with the tender care of a man transporting religious relics. Eric checked his own gear with the obsessive precision that had once been second nature, and was now a deliberate act of will. The rebreather was a modern closed-circuit system, capable of recycling his exhaled breath and extending his bottom time far beyond what open-circuit tanks would allow. But it was also a complex machine with multiple points of failure, and he had not worn one since the Bahamas. He tested the oxygen sensors, the counterlungs, the manual bypass valves, running through the checklist that David had provided with the slow care of a man relearning a language he had once spoken fluently, but had allowed to grow rusty through disuse. The equipment responded correctly, efficiently, indifferently. Machines did not care about redemption. They simply functioned or they did not, and Eric's job was to make sure that they functioned long enough to get him back to the surface. The journey to the blue hole took 3 hours, cutting across the shallow banks that separated Andros from the deeper water of the tongue of the ocean. Joseph piloted with a steady hand, reading the water in a way that seemed almost telepathic, adjusting their course to avoid the coral heads that rose like submerged tombstones from the sandy bottom. The sea was calm, almost suspiciously so, with a glassy flatness that reflected the sky with mirror-like precision, and made it difficult to distinguish where the air ended and the water began. Eric sat in the bow, watching the color of the ocean shift from the pale aquamarine of the banks to the deeper indigo of the offshore channels, and he felt the familiar tightening of anticipation that had once been the best part of his work. There was a moment in every expedition when the land fell away and the depth opened beneath you, and you understood with a clarity that no laboratory could provide that you were entering a realm where human presence was tolerated but never truly welcomed. That moment was coming, and Eric found that he was hungry for it in a way that disturbed him. They found the blue hole without difficulty, which surprised Eric given Marcus's description of its remoteness and obscurity. But Joseph knew exactly where he was going, steering the boat to a precise point where the color of the water changed abruptly from the deep blue of the surrounding channel to a black so absolute that it seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The hole was circular, perhaps 80 feet across, its perimeter marked by a ring of limestone that had been worn smooth by millennia of tidal action and human neglect. From the surface, There was nothing to distinguish it from any of the other submarine caves that dotted the Bahamian archipelago, no sign of the anomaly that had drawn Marcus's attention and his money. But as Eric leaned over the gunwale and looked down into the darkness, he felt something that he had not expected, a sensation that went beyond the normal apprehension of depth and entered the territory of something older and less rational. The water looked hungry. That was the only word he could find for it, inadequate though it was. The surface of the blue hole did not merely accept the light. It consumed it, pulling it down into depths that no sun had ever reached, and the darkness that waited below had a quality of intentionality that made Eric's hands tight involuntarily on the railing. "She's deep," Raphael said, coming up beside him and peering over with the practiced nonchalance of a man who had looked into many abysses and found them all essentially similar. 240 to the first chamber floor, according to the depth sounder, but the real fun starts after that. Joseph says there's a tunnel at the southwest corner that drops another 100 feet before it opens into the main cavern. That's where your structure is supposed to be. "Supposed to be," Eric repeated, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Marcus appeared on deck, already wearing his dry suit, the camera housings hanging from his harness like strange metallic fruit. He moved with the awkwardness of a man who had spent more time in boardrooms than in water, but there was no mistaking the intensity of his focus, the single-mindedness of his purpose. He had spent $2 million on this expedition, Eric knew, and he intended to get his money's worth in footage and discovery, regardless of what the actual scientific value of their findings might be. That was the venture capitalist's way. You invested in possibility, you managed risk, you accepted that some percentage of your ventures would fail in order to reap the rewards of the ones that succeeded. But Eric had begun to suspect that Marcus did not understand the difference between financial risk and mortal risk, that the percentages he was calculating did not include the possibility of death because death was not a variable that his world had ever seriously included. "Conditions are perfect," Marcus announced, as if he were reading from a prospectus rather than describing an environment that could kill them all in a dozen different ways. "Visibility should be 60 feet or better in the upper chamber. Current is minimal. We have 6 hours of daylight, and the rebreathers will give us 4 hours of bottom time if we're careful with the gas. That's plenty of time to reach the structure, document it, and get back to the surface before we hit deco obligations." David Chen, who had been checking his own equipment with the methodical patience of a bomb disposal technician, looked up at Marcus with an expression that Eric could not quite read. "4 hours is the theoretical maximum," he said quietly. "In practice, cave penetration adds stress that increases gas consumption, and if we get into complex navigation, the mental load burns through oxygen faster than the physical exertion. I recommend we set a turnaround time of 2 hours from the start of the descent. That gives us a safety margin." Marcus waved his hand in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously dismissive and gracious. Of course, safety first, but I think we'll find that the passage is more straightforward than we expect. The satellite data showed a clear path to the central chamber." "Satellites don't see inside caves," David replied, and there was no aggression in his voice, only the calm statement of a fact that he had learned through experience rather than through theory. "They see temperature differentials and magnetic anomalies. What they don't see is the silt that hasn't been disturbed in 10,000 years, or the stalactites that will tear through a dry suit like tissue paper, or the places where the limestone has been weakened by tidal action and is waiting for the vibration of a single fin kick to collapse. I've seen divers die in caves that looked perfectly safe from the outside. The ocean doesn't show you its teeth until you're already in its mouth." The silence that followed David's words was broken only by the slap of water against the hull and the distant cry of a frigate bird circling overhead. Marcus's smile had not faltered, but something in his eyes had hardened, a determination that Eric recognized as the refusal to be deterred by caution. It was the same look that Eric had seen in his own reflection during the months before the Bahamas incident. The look of a man who had convinced himself that the rules applied to other people, that his own expertise and preparation made him immune to the consequences that befell the careless and the unlucky. "We will follow your protocols, David," Marcus said finally, and the words were correct but the tone was wrong, carrying an undercurrent of impatience that made Eric's unease deepen. "But we will also remember why we are here. The structure at the bottom of that hole could change our understanding of marine biology, of geology, of human history itself. I didn't fund this expedition to turn around at the first sign of difficulty." Eric watched the exchange with the detached fascination of a man who had already seen the ending of this particular story and was simply waiting for the characters to arrive at it. He had been Marcus once, or something very like him. Driven, certain, convinced that the pursuit of knowledge justified any risk. The Bahamas had cured him of that certainty, had stripped away the protective arrogance that had allowed him to believe that his intelligence and his training made him special, made him safe. What remained was something harder and more brittle, a kind of fatalistic acceptance that the ocean would do what the ocean would do, and that the best you could hope for was to survive long enough to tell someone else what you had seen. They entered the water in pairs, David and Raphael first, followed by Eric and Marcus. Joseph remained in the boat, his face unreadable as he watched them clip their gear and perform their final checks. He said nothing as Eric rolled backward over the gunwale and dropped into the water, but Eric felt the weight of the old man's gaze following him down through the first 10 feet of descent, a pressure almost physical in its intensity, as if Joseph were trying to warn him with the force of his attention alone. The water closed over Eric's head with the familiar shock of temperature change, the warm surface layer giving way to the cooler depths, with a gradient that he felt through his dry suit like the passage from one world into another. He cleared his ears and checked his buoyancy, establishing neutral trim with the automatic reflexes that had been drilled into him through years of practice. Above him, the surface was a shimmering ceiling of liquid silver, distorting the hull of the boat into an abstract pattern of light and shadow. Below him, the darkness waited. He activated his primary light, a powerful LED array that cut through the water with a beam so intense it seemed almost solid. The first thing it revealed was the wall of the blue hole itself, a vertical shaft of limestone that dropped away into depths that his light could not penetrate, its surface marked with the irregular patterns of erosion and mineral deposition that spoke of geological ages beyond human comprehension. The water was indeed clear, visibility approaching the 60 feet that Marcus had promised, and as Eric oriented himself and began his descent, he felt the first stirrings of something that he had almost forgotten: the pure, uncomplicated joy of exploration, the sense of entering a space that had never been mapped by human intention. The upper chamber was breathtaking, even by the standards of a man who had spent his professional life in environments of exceptional beauty. The limestone walls were sculpted by water into flowing forms that seemed almost organic, as if the stone itself had once been alive and had only recently settled into stillness. Stalactites hung in fragile profusion from the ceiling, their tips pointing downward like the teeth of some vast creature, suspended in the moment before closing its jaws. The water was so clear that Eric could see details at the edge of visibility that would have been lost in murkier conditions. The texture of the stone, the slow drift of particulate matter suspended in the current, the occasional flash of a fish too small to identify darting away from the intrusion of his light. He followed David and Raphael down the guideline that they had anchored to a rock outcropping near the surface, the bright orange cord falling away beneath them like a thread dropped into a well of infinite depth. Marcus swam beside him, his cameras already recording, the red indicator lights glowing like tiny embers in the surrounding blue. Eric could hear the other man's breathing through the hydrophone in his communications rig, regular and controlled. But there was an excitement in it that Eric found worrying, an elevation of respiratory rate that suggested Marcus was already burning through his gas faster than the dive plan allowed. "Beautiful," Marcus's voice crackled through the earpiece, and the word seemed inadequate, almost offensive in its banality. "Absolutely beautiful. The clarity is extraordinary. We must be at 100 feet now." 120, David's voice corrected, calm and precise. "Keep your depth discipline. The tunnel entrance is at 150. We don't want to hit it too fast and stir up the silt." Eric checked his own depth gauge, confirming the reading, and felt the familiar compression of time and space that came with deep-water immersion. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis was already beginning to exert its subtle influence, a mild euphoria and impairment of judgment that divers called rapture of the deep, with the grim humor of men who knew that the rapture could become deadly without warning. He monitored his own mental state with the rigor of a man who had learned to distrust his own perceptions, watching for the first signs of impaired reasoning, the subtle shifts in cognitive processing that marked the onset of the condition. So far, he felt clear, focused, alert. But he knew that the judgment of one's own impairment was itself impaired by the narcosis, a recursive trap that had claimed the lives of experienced divers who had been convinced of their own competence even as they made decisions that would kill them. They reached the tunnel entrance at 155 feet, a horizontal passage that opened from the wall of the vertical shaft like a mouth waiting to receive them. The guideline continued into it, and Eric could see that David and Raphael had already begun their passage, their lights casting elongated shadows against the curving walls of the tunnel. The current here was different from the stillness of the upper chamber, a gentle but unmistakable pull that drew the water inward, toward whatever lay beyond. "Currents inbound," Raphael reported, his voice carrying the relaxed tone of a man discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a potential hazard. "Not strong, but consistent. Could make the exit swim a little more interesting." "Noted," David replied. "Stay close to the line. If visibility drops, we'll switch to touch contact protocol." Eric followed Marcus into the tunnel, his light sweeping across walls that were narrower and more irregular than the upper shaft. The limestone here was darker, stained with minerals that had leached from the surrounding rock over millennia, and the formations were more aggressive, sharp edges and sudden projections that demanded careful fin placement to avoid contact. The current pushed gently against his chest, not enough to impede his progress, but enough to remind him that the water was moving, that it had a destination in mind that had nothing to do with his own intentions. The tunnel widened after 50 feet, opening into a second chamber that was larger and more cathedral-like than the first. Eric's light, powerful as it was, could not illuminate the far walls, and the ceiling was lost in darkness above them. But what his light did reveal made him stop swimming for a moment, hanging in the water with his buoyancy holding him at a constant depth while his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The chamber was filled with diving equipment. Not scattered randomly, as if dropped in panic, but arranged with a care that suggested purpose, even ritual. Regulators hung from stalactites by their hoses, arranged in rows that gleamed in the beam of Eric's light. Wetsuits in styles that dated to the 1950s and 60s were stretched across the walls, their rubber surfaces preserved by the cold, anaerobic water in a state of perfect, terrible stasis. Masks, fins, weight belts, knives, cameras, all the paraphernalia of human exploration, were displayed throughout the space like the collection of some obsessive curator who had spent decades acquiring the perfect specimens of a species that visited only rarely. "My God," Marcus breathed, and for the first time since Eric had met him, the venture capitalist's voice carried something other than confidence and calculation. "What is this? A graveyard?" "A collection," Eric said, and the word came out flatter than he intended, stripped of the horror that he was beginning to feel building in his chest. "Something has been collecting trophies." David had moved closer to one of the wetsuits, his light playing across its surface with the professional detachment of a man who had seen death in many forms and had learned to examine it without flinching. "This is old gear," he said quietly. "Twin hose regulators, canvas harnesses. This stuff hasn't been manufactured in 50 years. And look at the condition. No corrosion, no decay. The cold water and the lack of oxygen have preserved everything perfectly." "But where are the divers?" Raphael asked, and the question hung in the water like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of implication outward that Eric could feel in his gut. "You don't get equipment without people, and there's a lot of equipment here." Eric swam slowly through the chamber, his light revealing more of the collection with each passing moment. There were tanks here too, steel cylinders in the rounded shape that had been standard before the advent of modern aluminum designs, and they were arranged in clusters that suggested the teams that had carried them. He counted 12 sets of gear, maybe more, spread across the walls and floor of the chamber in a display that was too organized to be accidental and too comprehensive to be the work of currents or gravity. "This isn't natural," he said, knowing even as he spoke that he was stating the obvious, that every member of the team had already reached the same conclusion. "Something brought these here. Something arranged them." "Brought them from where?" Marcus asked, and his voice had regained some of its composure, the entrepreneur's mind already working on the problem of classification and explanation. "The blue hole is remote, but it's not unknown. Divers have explored these waters for decades. If there had been a string of disappearances, we would know about it. There would be records, reports, search operations." "Would there?" Eric asked, and he heard the darkness in his own voice, the reflection of the Bahamas in every syllable. "How many divers go missing in the Bahamas every year? How many are written off as accidents, equipment failures, medical emergencies? The ocean doesn't keep records, Marcus. It just keeps what it takes." They moved through the chamber with greater caution now, the initial wonder of the discovery giving way to a vigilance that Eric could feel radiating from every member of the team. The guideline continued across the floor, heading toward a passage on the far side that was narrower and darker than the one they had entered through. The current was stronger here, a distinct pull that tugged at Eric's fins and demanded a more aggressive swimming posture to maintain position. "Currents increased," David noted, his voice carrying the tightness of professional concern. "It's not just flowing through anymore, it's being drawn toward something." "The central chamber," Marcus said, consulting the waterproof tablet that he had clipped to his harness. "According to the satellite data, there should be a large open space beyond this passage. That's where the structure is located." "Structure," Eric repeated, and the word had begun to sound like a prayer or a curse, he couldn't tell which. "You keep saying that, Marcus, but what if what we're looking at isn't a structure? What if it's something else entirely?" "Like what?" "I don't know, that's the problem. I don't know what would collect diving equipment like this, preserve it for decades, arrange it with this kind of care. I've never seen anything like it in any literature, any field report, any documented case study. Whatever did this, it isn't in the catalogs. It isn't in the taxonomy." "Then we'll be the first to document it," Marcus said, and the confidence in his voice had returned in full force, the horror of the chamber already processed and filed away under the heading of interesting data point. "That's why we're here, Eric, to see things that no one else has seen, to know things that no one else knows. That's the whole point of exploration." Eric looked at the venture capitalist with something that might have been pity if he had been capable of feeling pity for a man who was so clearly eager to meet the fate that Eric had barely survived once before. "The point of exploration," he said quietly, "is to come back and tell people about it. The ones who don't come back aren't explorers. They're just dead." They entered the narrow passage in single file, David leading, followed by Raphael, then Marcus, with Eric bringing up the rear. The walls were close enough to touch on both sides, and Eric kept his arms tucked against his body to avoid contact with the sharp limestone. The current was stronger here, no longer a gentle pull but a steady flow that demanded constant finning to maintain forward progress. He could feel the water moving past him, carrying particles of sediment that sparkled in his light like microscopic stars, and beneath the sound of his own breathing and the rhythmic hiss of the rebreather's solenoids, he began to hear something else. It was a thumping, low, rhythmic, massive, the same sound that the camera had recorded on the beach, the same vibration that had trembled through the sand beneath Eric's desperate hands. But here, in the confined space of the tunnel, it was louder, more immediate, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the water itself, from the hollow spaces inside his own skull. Each impact sent a pressure wave through the water that Eric could feel against his chest and face, a physical sensation like being in the presence of a giant heartbeat. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice sounding strange and small in his own ears. "Hear what?" Marcus replied, but there was a tension in his voice that suggested he was hearing something too, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. "That thumping like a heartbeat." "I don't hear anything except the current and my own breathing," Marcus said, but his voice was too quick, too defensive, and Eric knew that he was lying. David had stopped swimming ahead of them, his light fixed on something in the passage that Eric couldn't yet see. "Hold position," the dive master said, and the command in his voice was absolute, the tone of a man who had encountered something that demanded immediate and total attention. "Something's wrong with the guideline." Eric finned forward, closing the distance to the others, and saw what David was looking at. The orange guideline, their lifeline to the surface, had been cut. Not frayed by abrasion or snagged on a rock, but cleanly severed, the two ends floating in the current like the tentacles of some strange sea creature. The cut was recent, the nylon fibers still sharp and unweathered, and as Eric's light played across the walls of the passage, he saw the marks that had made it. They were claw marks, deep gouges in the limestone, parallel lines that ran vertically down the wall in sets of 3 or 4, each groove carved with a precision that suggested terrible strength and even more terrible intention. The marks were organic, not geological, and they were fresh, the exposed stone lighter in color than the surrounding surface, as if whatever had made them had done so within hours rather than millennia. "Those weren't here when we came through," Raphael said, and for the first time since Eric had met him, the young dive master's voice carried the unmistakable edge of fear. "I checked the walls on the way in. These passages are tight, you notice everything. Those marks were not here." "Then something made them while we were in the chamber," David said, and his voice was steady but his light was trembling slightly, a tremor that Eric had never seen in the dive master's hands before. "Something came through this passage after we passed, and it cut the line." "Why?" Marcus asked, and the question hung in the water with a naivety that would have been almost touching if the circumstances had been different. "Why would anything cut the line?" "To trap us," Eric said, and the words came out with a certainty that he felt in his bones, a knowledge that had nothing to do with rational analysis and everything to do with the primal recognition of predator and prey. "To keep us from going back." The current shifted then, not gradually as currents normally do, but suddenly and violently, as if a valve had been opened somewhere in the depths ahead of them. Eric felt himself being pulled forward, his fins struggling for purchase against the flow that had gone from manageable to irresistible in the space of a single breath. He grabbed for the wall, his gloved fingers finding purchase on the rough limestone, and he saw David and Raphael doing the same, anchoring themselves against the surge that threatened to sweep them deeper into the passage. Marcus was not so lucky. The venture capitalist had been in the center of the tunnel when the current hit, too far from either wall to find a handhold, and Eric watched in frozen horror as Marcus was swept past him, his body tumbling in the rush of water like a discarded doll, his lights spinning crazily and casting insane shadows across the walls. He slammed into the far end of the passage with a force that Eric could hear even through the water, a sickening impact that drove the air from Marcus's lungs in a burst of bubbles that rose toward the ceiling in a silver column. "Marcus!" Eric shouted, but the name was lost in the roar of the current, swallowed by the water that was now flowing with the intensity of a river in flood. He saw David release his hold on the wall and kick after Marcus, the dive master's powerful strokes carrying him through the surge with a skill that spoke of years of experience in exactly these kinds of conditions. Raphael followed, and Eric, with no other choice, pushed himself away from the wall and let the current carry him forward, his body tumbling in the rush as he fought to orient himself and maintain some semblance of control. The passage emptied into a space that was larger than anything Eric had imagined, a chamber so vast that his light could not find its boundaries, and the current deposited him in its center with a gentleness that was almost obscene after the violence of his passage through the tunnel. He righted himself, checking his equipment with the automatic reflexes that had been drilled into him through years of training, and swept his light across the space in search of the others. David and Raphael were nearby, both apparently unhurt, their lights already searching for Marcus. Eric joined them, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that he could feel even through the compression of the deep water, and together they scanned the chamber for any sign of the venture capitalist. They found his light first, wedged between two rocks at the edge of the chamber, still burning with a fierce white intensity that made the shadows around it seem even darker by contrast. But Marcus was not with it. His harness was there, the straps severed with the same clean precision that had cut the guideline, and one of his cameras was still recording, its lens pointed upward at an angle that captured nothing but empty water and darkness. The other camera was gone along with Marcus's rebreather, his tanks, his body. "Where is he?" Raphael asked, and his voice was higher now, stripped of the casual confidence that had characterized him on the surface. "He was right behind me. I saw him get swept past. He should be here." "He should be," David agreed, and his light was moving in a systematic pattern, covering every corner of the visible chamber with the thoroughness of a search and rescue operation. "But he's not." Eric swam to the far wall, his light tracing the surface of the limestone, and what he found there made him stop breathing for a moment, his chest frozen in a spasm of terror that had nothing to do with the depth or the pressure or the nitrogen in his bloodstream. The wall was moving. Not the whole wall, but sections of it, patches of limestone that seemed to shift and flow like oil on water, their color changing from the gray-white of the surrounding stone to a darker, more iridescent hue that Eric recognized with a shock of recognition that went through him like electricity. It was the same color as the slime on the driftwood, the same blue that he had seen on the beach in the footage that had begun this nightmare. And as he watched, frozen in place by a horror that transcended anything he had experienced in the Bahamas, the patches of moving color began to coalesce, drawing together into shapes that resolved themselves with terrible clarity into the texture of tentacles, the curve of suckers, the gleam of something that might have been an eye opening in the darkness. The chamber was not a chamber, the walls were not walls, and they were not alone. The realization hit Eric with the force of a physical blow, a wave of understanding that swept through his mind and left nothing standing in its wake. The structure that Marcus had seen on the satellite imagery was not a geological formation. It was not a human construction. It was a creature, or a part of a creature, a living thing so vast that it had filled the cavern system with its own body, its skin blending so perfectly with the limestone that the distinction between organism and environment had ceased to exist. The blue hole was not empty. It was occupied, had been occupied for longer than human memory could reach, and the thing that lived here had been waiting for them, or for something like them, with a patience that made Eric's concept of time seem like the fluttering of a moth against a lamp. "Eric," David's voice crackled through the communicator, urgent and sharp, cutting through the fog of Eric's paralysis. "What are you looking at? What's wrong?" The walls, Eric managed to say, and his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone very far away and very afraid. David, the walls are alive. The whole chamber, it's not rock, it's skin. What? Look at the texture. Look at the way it's moving. That's not limestone, David. That's camouflage. The creature is the environment. It's been the environment all along. Raphael's light joined Eric's, playing across the surface of the wall, and Eric heard the young man's breath catch in his throat, a sharp intake that carried all the terror of comprehension. Mater de Dios, Raphael whispered. Mater de Dios, he's right. Look at the patterns. That's not mineral deposition. Those are chromatophores, like a cuttlefish, but massive. Massive. The wall pulsed then, a contraction that ran through the entire visible surface like a wave, and Eric felt the pressure change in the water, a surge that pushed him backward and sent him tumbling away from the wall with a force that he could not resist. He righted himself, his training asserting itself over his terror, and saw that the chamber was transforming around them, the static geometry of stone giving way to the dynamic architecture of muscle and intention. The floor was rising, the ceiling was descending, and the walls were drawing inward with a motion that was horrifyingly deliberate, as if the space itself had decided to close its fist around them. "We need to get out of here," David said, and for the first time since Eric had met him, the dive master's voice carried the absolute authority of command without any attempt at diplomacy or consensus. "Now, follow the guideline back to the passage." "The guideline is cut," Eric reminded him, but he was already moving, kicking toward the tunnel entrance with every ounce of strength that his legs could generate. "Then we follow the current. It has to flow somewhere. There's an exit." "Or an entrance," Eric said, but he was following David, and Raphael was following him, the three of them swimming in formation toward the passage that had brought them into this nightmare, their lights cutting through the water in desperate arcs that revealed nothing but more darkness, more of the pulsing, living stone that surrounded them on every side. They reached the tunnel entrance and found it changed. The narrow passage that had been their route in now collapsed or sealed, the opening blocked by a wall of material that looked like limestone but moved with the slow, peristaltic rhythm of something digesting its prey. David pushed against it with his hands, testing its solidity, and Eric saw the surface yield slightly under the pressure before springing back into shape, elastic and resilient and utterly impassable. "Blocked," David reported, his voice tight with the strain of maintaining his composure. "The whole passage is gone." "Then we find another way," Raphael said, but his voice was rising toward panic, the controlled breathing of the trained diver giving way to the ragged gasps of a man who was beginning to understand that the odds had turned against him in a way that no amount of skill or experience could overcome. "There have to be other passages. Caves always have multiple exits." "Not always," Eric said, and he swept his light across the chamber, searching for any crack or crevice that might offer escape, any gap in the living walls that might lead to freedom. But the creature's skin was everywhere, seamless and complete, and the only openings were the ones that it allowed to exist, the passages that led deeper rather than outward, downward rather than up. The thumping was louder now, a constant vibration that filled the water and resonated in Eric's chest and skull, with a physicality that made it difficult to think, difficult to plan, difficult to do anything except react to the immediate demands of survival. He could feel the creature's heartbeat, or whatever passed for a heartbeat in an organism that operated on a scale of biology that he could not comprehend, and the rhythm was increasing, accelerating, as if the presence of prey in its digestive space had triggered some metabolic process that was now running toward completion. "It's hunting us," Eric said, and the words came out with a flat certainty that surprised even him. "It knows we're here. It's been waiting for us." "Waiting for what?" Raphael demanded, his voice breaking on the question. "What does it want?" "It wants what everything wants," Eric replied, and he heard the despair in his own voice, the bitter wisdom of a man who had learned too late that the universe was not indifferent but actively hostile. It wants to eat. The water around them began to move then, not in the steady flow of the current, but in a circular motion that built with terrifying speed, spinning them around the center of the chamber in a vortex that Eric recognized with a fresh wave of horror. The creature was creating a whirlpool, using its tentacles to stir the water into a centrifuge that would hold them at depth while it prepared to feed, a strategy of predation that required not just strength but intelligence, a planning capacity that went beyond the instinctive responses of a simple animal. Eric fought against the spin, his fins beating uselessly against the force of the water that was now moving with the speed of a river in flood. He could see David and Raphael being pulled in the same direction, their bodies tumbling in the current like leaves in a storm drain, and he knew with a certainty that was beyond doubt that if they did not find a way out of this vortex in the next few minutes, they would not find a way out at all. He slammed into something hard and unyielding, the impact driving the breath from his lungs in a burst of bubbles that rose toward the ceiling of the chamber in a silver trail. For a moment he thought he had hit the wall, but then his hands found purchase on a surface that was rough and textured in a way that limestone was not, and he realized that he had collided with one of the displays from the trophy chamber, a cluster of diving equipment that the creature had arranged with such care, and that now served as an anchor in the spinning water. He grabbed a steel tank, wrapping his arms around it and holding on with a desperation that made his muscles scream in protest. The tank was old, pitted but solid, and it gave him enough stability to resist the pull of the vortex, to hold his position while the water spun around him in a blur of motion and darkness. Through the chaos, he could see David and Raphael struggling similarly, each finding handholds on the collected equipment and clinging to them with the same white-knuckled intensity that Eric was employing. But the vortex was strengthening, the speed of the water increasing with each passing second, and Eric knew that their handholds would not last. The equipment was old, preserved by the anaerobic environment but not designed to withstand the forces that were now being applied to it. Sooner or later, something would give way, and then they would be swept into the center of the chamber, into the waiting maw of whatever was creating this terrible spinning prison. He looked for the source of the vortex, his light cutting through the murk that the spinning water had raised from the floor, and what he saw made him want to close his eyes and never open them again. The center of the chamber was clearing, the water there becoming still and dark, and from that darkness something was emerging. It was not the whole creature. That would have been too large to fit in any space that Eric could comprehend. But it was a part of the creature, a portion of the whole that was nevertheless larger than any animal that Eric had ever encountered in his professional life. The mouth emerged first, or what Eric's mind identified as a mouth, because there was no other word for the opening that was now gaping in the center of the chamber. It was a shark's maw, but scaled to a size that made the great white seem like a minnow in comparison. Rows of triangular teeth that were each the length of Eric's forearm curving inward in a spiral pattern that led down into a gullet that seemed to have no bottom. The teeth were not white, as shark teeth were in the textbooks, but a yellowed ivory color that suggested age beyond measuring, and they were set in gums that pulsed with the same iridescent blue that Eric had seen on the driftwood and on the walls of the chamber. And surrounding the mouth, emerging from the darkness like the petals of some obscene flower, were the tentacles. They were thick, muscular, lined with suckers that opened and closed with a rhythmic motion that suggested hunger and anticipation, and they moved with a grace that was almost beautiful in its efficiency, each one finding its place in the architecture of the vortex and contributing to the spinning current that held the divers in place. There were dozens of them, maybe more, and they filled the water with a writhing complexity that made Eric's eyes struggle to track them, his brain rebelling against the attempt to process so much motion and malice in a single field of vision. "It's a Lusca," Eric heard himself say, and the word came from somewhere deep in his memory, from the folklore that he had dismissed as superstition during his academic career, from the stories that the old fishermen told about creatures that lived in the blue holes and dragged boats down into the depths. It's a Lusca. It's real. I don't care what it's called, Raphael screamed, and his voice was raw with terror, stripped of every pretense of courage or control. I care how we get away from it. We don't, Eric said, and the words were not despair but something else, a kind of terrible clarity that had come over him in the face of the monster. Not by swimming, not by fighting. It's too big, too strong, too smart. We have to think. We have to understand it. That's the only way. Understand it. David's voice was incredulous, but there was a note in it that suggested he was listening, that the dive master had not yet surrendered to panic. How do we understand something like that? It's biology, Eric said, and he forced his mind to work, to set aside the terror and apply the analytical tools that had been his profession before they had become his shame. Everything is biology. Look at the skin. It's reactive. It changes color. That means it has chromatophores, light-sensitive cells that respond to stimuli. And look at the way it's using the tentacles to create the vortex. That's not random. That's strategic. It has a nervous system, sensory organs, behavioral patterns, and if it has patterns, we can exploit them. Exploit them how? Raphael demanded. We don't have weapons, we don't have tools, we have dive knives and flares, and that's it. Flares, Eric repeated, and the word triggered something in his memory, a connection that formed with the suddenness of inspiration. Light. It's sensitive to light. The chromatophores respond to light. That's why it lives in absolute darkness, why it only comes to the surface at night. Light hurts it. Light confuses it. He reached for his harness, his fingers finding the pocket where he kept his emergency equipment. There were 3 dive flares there, chemical light sources that burned with an intense white heat and were intended for signaling rather than illumination. He had carried them on every dive since his certification, never expecting to use them for anything more serious than marking his position for a surface pickup. "What are you doing?" David asked. "Distracting it," Eric said, and he pulled the first flare from its pocket, his fingers working with the desperate precision of a bomb disposal technician. If I'm right, light overloads its sensory system. It can't process too much visual information. It has to choose between processing the light and processing us. And if it's anything like other cephalopods, the chromatophore response will be automatic, involuntary. It won't be able to stop itself from reacting. And if you're wrong, then we're no worse off than we are now. He activated the flare, twisting the base to ignite the chemical compound, and the result was instantaneous and blinding. The flare erupted with a light that was painful even through the mask, a pure white intensity that turned the water around Eric into a solid wall of brilliance. He held it out, pointing it toward the center of the chamber where the mouth and tentacles waited, and he saw the effect immediately. The creature convulsed. The iridescent blue of its skin flared through the entire spectrum of visible color, shifting from blue to green to yellow to red in a cascade of chromatic response that was almost psychedelic in its intensity. The tentacles that had been so precisely controlling the vortex spasmed, whipping through the water in uncontrolled arcs that shattered the careful architecture of the current and sent the water churning in chaotic directions. The mouth snapped shut, then opened, then shut again, a gesture of distress that Eric recognized with a surge of hope that was almost as painful as the fear had been. "It's working," he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of holding the flare steady against the turbulence that was now rocking him back and forth. "The light is overloading its system." "Then use all of them," David commanded, and there was authority in his voice again, the command presence of a man who had seen a path through the darkness and was determined to follow it. "Light the whole chamber." Eric pulled the second flare and ignited it, tossing it toward the far wall where it sank slowly through the water, its brilliance casting insane shadows across the writhing surface of the creature's skin. He ignited the third and threw it in the opposite direction, creating a triangle of intense light that filled the chamber with a glare that made it impossible to see anything clearly, that turned the nightmare into a blinding abstraction of color and motion. The creature's reaction was catastrophic, at least from its perspective. Its entire body went into spasm, the chromatophores firing in random patterns that made its skin look like a television tuned to a dead channel, all noise and no signal. The vortex collapsed, the water settling into turbulent chaos that was nevertheless free of the centrifugal force that had been holding them prisoner. And the walls began to pull back, the living tissue retreating from the light in a gesture that was almost animal in its desperation, creating gaps and openings where before there had been only seamless flesh. "There's a passage," Raphael shouted, pointing toward a dark gap that had opened in the wall where the creature's retreat had exposed an underlying structure of limestone. "I can see a passage." "Go," Eric screamed, his voice raw. "Go now." They swam for the opening, kicking with every ounce of strength that remained in their oxygen-starved muscles, their bodies propelled by adrenaline and the terrible knowledge that this chance would not come again. Eric went last, holding his position until David and Raphael were through the gap, and then he kicked after them, his light sweeping across the chamber one final time to confirm what he already knew. The creature was recovering. Even as he watched, the spasmodic twitching of its skin was subsiding, the chromatophores beginning to settle back into their camouflaged patterns, the tentacles regaining their purposeful motion. It had been stunned, not killed, and the stun was temporary, a matter of seconds rather than minutes. But seconds were all they needed, all that stood between escape and digestion, and Eric used them with the desperate economy of a man spending his last coins. He shot through the gap in the wall and found himself in a narrow chimney of limestone that rose at a steep angle toward the surface. David and Raphael were ahead of him, their lights bobbing in the darkness as they clawed their way upward, using their hands as well as their fins to pull themselves through the tight space. Eric followed, his shoulders scraping against the walls, his tanks clanging against the rock with each desperate kick, and behind him he could feel the creature's attention returning, could sense the massive body shifting in the chamber as it oriented itself toward the fleeing prey. The chimney was collapsing. He heard it before he saw it, a grinding sound that vibrated through the rock and into his bones, and then he felt the first pieces of limestone breaking away from the walls and tumbling past him in the water, heavy chunks of stone that would crush him if they struck his head or his tanks. The creature was shredding the rock with its tentacles, tearing apart the only exit in its fury at losing its meal, and Eric understood with perfect clarity that he was swimming through a death trap that was closing around him with each passing second. He kicked harder, ignoring the burning in his legs and the screaming in his lungs, pulling himself up through the chimney with a strength that he did not know he possessed. David was above him, almost at the top, and Raphael was just ahead, his hand reaching for a ledge that marked the entrance to a wider passage. Eric clawed at the rock, his fingers finding purchase on rough edges and mineral deposits, and he hauled himself upward through the rain of falling stone that was now filling the chimney behind him. A tentacle lashed past his ankle, close enough that he felt the suction cups brush against his dry suit, and he kicked with a violence that tore something in his hip, sending a bolt of agony through his body that he ignored completely in the face of the greater pain that waited if that tentacle found its grip. The limb withdrew, blocked by the falling rock that was now choking the chimney, and Eric used the moment of respite to surge upward, his hand closing on Raphael's outstretched palm, and the young dive master hauling him into the passage above with a strength born of mutual desperation. They were in a horizontal tunnel now, wider than the chimney but still claustrophobic, and Eric could see the faint blue glow of open water ahead of them, the unmistakable signature of the surface filtering down through the depths. They swam for it, all three of them moving as a unit now, their individual identities submerged in the collective will to survive, and behind them the sounds of destruction echoed through the water as the creature tore apart its own lair in pursuit of the prey that had escaped. The passage opened into the upper chamber, the one with the trophy collection, and Eric felt a surge of relief that was almost dizzying as he recognized the space, the familiar arrangement of preserved equipment that now seemed almost welcoming in its human association. They were close. They were so close. The vertical shaft that led to the surface was just ahead, and beyond it lay the boat and Joseph, and the open sky that Eric had never thought he would see again. But the water was moving again, the current that had been gentle on their descent now building into something fierce and directional, pulling them not toward the surface, but back toward the depths, back toward the creature that was somehow still exerting its will on the environment even from the collapsed chamber below. Eric felt the pull on his legs, the water rushing past him with a force that was increasing with each passing moment, and he understood that the creature was creating a vacuum, a massive suction effect that would draw everything in the blue hole down into its waiting maw. "Swim!" he screamed, though the word was unnecessary, though every member of the team was already swimming with a desperation that transcended language. "Swim for the surface! Don't stop! Don't look back!" They hit the vertical shaft and kicked upward, their fins beating against the water with a rhythm that was driven by terror rather than technique, their bodies ascending through the clear water with a speed that would have earned them a reprimand from any dive instructor for the risk of decompression sickness. But decompression sickness was a problem for the future, and the future was a luxury that they could not afford. The present was all that mattered, the present and the 20 feet of water that separated them from the air and the light and the world above. Eric broke the surface with a violence that sent water cascading from his mask and regulator, his head emerging into a world of noise and chaos that was almost as disorienting as the underwater darkness had been. The boat was there, but it was not where they had left it. Joseph had the engines at full throttle, the propellers churning the water into a froth of white and silver, and the boat was moving in a tight circle around the perimeter of the blue hole, fighting against a force that was pulling it inexorably toward the center. "Grab the line," Joseph was screaming, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines and the deeper, more terrible sound that was coming from the water itself, a low-frequency vibration that Eric could feel in his chest and teeth. "Grab the line and hold on." A rope was trailing from the stern, bouncing across the surface of the water as the boat struggled against the current, and Eric lunged for it, his gloved hands closing on the nylon with a grip that was desperate and absolute. He felt the rope go taut, felt the power of the engines transferring through the line and into his body, and then he was being dragged through the water, skipping across the surface like a stone thrown by a giant hand, the boat pulling him away from the center of the blue hole with a force that was just barely sufficient to overcome the drag of the vortex that was forming there. David and Raphael were behind him, each grabbing their own lines, and Joseph gunned the engines harder, the boat leaping forward as if propelled by rockets, breaking free of the suction with a suddenness that sent them all tumbling across the deck in a heap of equipment and exhaustion. Eric lay on his back, staring up at the sky, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing, his body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and cold, and the terrible knowledge of what they had survived. But survival, he was beginning to understand, was not the same as escape. Not when the creature had marked him, not when the blue slime was already working its way into his pores, not when the vibration that he could feel in his bones was matching the rhythm of his own heartbeat, with a synchronization that suggested connection rather than coincidence. He sat up, slowly, painfully, and looked back at the blue hole. The water had settled into a perfect calm, a mirrored circle of black that reflected the sky with an innocence that was obscene in its contrast to what lay beneath. There was no sign of the creature, no disturbance on the surface, no evidence that anything had happened at all. The blue hole looked exactly as it had when they had arrived that morning, a natural feature of the landscape, a geological curiosity waiting for the next group of explorers to drop into its depths. But Eric knew. He knew what was down there, what had always been down there, what would always be down there, waiting with a patience that made human ambition seem like the buzzing of flies. And he knew, with a certainty that went beyond fear into the territory of fatalistic acceptance, that he had not escaped it. Not really. Not completely. The slime on his hands was beginning to glow, faintly, a pulsing blue luminescence that matched the rhythm of the deep vibration coming from the water. He scrubbed at it with his gloved hands, but the glow did not diminish. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent, a beacon that announced his presence to whatever waited in the darkness below. He didn't tell the others. There was nothing to tell that would change anything, no information that would help them understand or prepare. The mark was on him, and it would stay on him, and someday, when the glow grew bright enough, when the vibration became loud enough, the creature would come to collect what it had claimed. But that was a problem for another day. For now, Eric Vance was alive, and the sun was warm on his face, and the boat was carrying him away from the Throat of Andros with a speed that felt like flight. He closed his eyes and let the exhaustion take him, sinking into a darkness that was, for the moment, empty of monsters. And far below, in the chamber that was not a chamber, the walls pulsed with a slow, patient rhythm, and the creature that was the environment waited for the next curiosity to drop into its mouth, knowing that in the end, all things that swam eventually sank, and all things that sank eventually fed the deep. The boat ride back to Fresh Creek was a journey through a silence that was deeper than any Eric had experienced in the blue hole itself. David sat in the bow, methodically disassembling his rebreather with hands that still trembled slightly, checking each component with the obsessive care of a man who needed to prove to himself that his equipment had not failed him, that the failure had been somewhere else, in the realm of judgment rather than machinery. Raphael was in the stern, staring back at the wake that stretched behind them like a scar across the water, his eyes fixed on the point where the blue hole had swallowed the horizon, as if he expected to see something rising from the depths to claim them even now, even after they had escaped. Joseph piloted with the steady competence of a man who had seen terrible things before, and had learned that the only response to terror was to keep moving, to put distance between yourself and the horror, until the distance became memory and memory became story and story became something that could be told without shaking. Eric sat amidships, his wet suit still dripping onto the deck, his body aching in places he had not known could ache. The rebreather hung from his shoulders like a dead weight, its hoses tangled around his chest in a parody of the careful arrangement he had maintained on the descent. He should have been stripping it off, should have been checking his own gear, should have been doing any of the 100 things that a responsible diver did after an emergency ascent. But he could not move. He could only sit and stare at his hands and watch the faint blue luminescence that pulsed beneath his skin with a rhythm that matched the deep vibration still resonating in his bones. The slime was not coming off. He had scrubbed at it with his gloved hands on the boat, had wiped his palms against the rough fabric of his dry suit, had even dipped his fingers in the ocean as the boat sped across the shallows, hoping that the salt water would dissolve whatever adhesive property the substance possessed. But the blue film remained, faint but unmistakable, a ghostly patina that seemed to have bonded with his skin at a molecular level. And it was growing stronger, the luminescence increasing with each passing minute, as if the substance were feeding on his body heat or his adrenaline or some other biological signal that he could not identify. "You should get out of that suit," David said, not looking up from his equipment. "Hypothermia's still a risk, even in these temperatures." "I'm fine," Eric lied, and the words felt strange in his mouth, distant and disconnected from the reality of his body. "You're not fine. None of us are fine. We just watched a man get eaten by something that shouldn't exist, in a place that shouldn't be possible. We're alive, and that's something, but fine is a long way from here." Eric didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would change the truth of David's assessment, nothing that would make the facts any less terrible or the memories any less vivid. He closed his eyes and saw the mouth again, the spiral of teeth, the tentacles writhing in the light of the flares. He opened them and saw the blue glow on his hands, and he understood with a clarity that was almost religious in its intensity that the two images were connected, that the creature had marked him in some way that went beyond physical contact, that the slime was not residue but intention. The trip across the open water seemed to take hours, though Eric knew from his watch that it had been less than one. Time had become elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that had nothing to do with the movement of the clock's hands, and everything to do with the chemistry of adrenaline and shock that was still flooding his system. He watched the shoreline approach with the detached fascination of a man watching his own life unfold on a movie screen, unable to affect the outcome, but unable to look away. The mangroves that marked the entrance to Fresh Creek looked different now, their twisted roots reaching into the water like the fingers of something trying to drag itself back to land. And the houses that dotted the shoreline seemed fragile and temporary, dollhouses that could be swept away by any sufficiently determined tide. Joseph brought the boat into the marina with a gentle competence that seemed almost surreal after the violence of their escape. The docks were quiet, the fishing boats tied up for the evening, their owners already home with their families, unaware that something ancient and hungry had stirred in the waters a few miles to the east. The normalcy of the scene was offensive in its ordinariness, the gentle slap of water against hulls, the cry of gulls overhead, the smell of diesel and fish that was as familiar as any harbor in the world. Eric climbed onto the dock with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had not just swum through a nightmare and emerged on the other side. They did not speak as they unloaded their gear. There was no need for words that would only confirm what they all knew, that Marcus Whitfield was dead, that the expedition had been a catastrophic failure, that whatever they had found in the blue hole was not the discovery that would redeem Eric's career, but the confirmation of his worst fears about the nature of the deep. The equipment was packed away with the mechanical efficiency of men performing a ritual they had performed 100 times before, but there was no joy in it, no sense of accomplishment, only the hollow satisfaction of tasks completed and lives preserved. Raphael caught Eric's eye as they stacked the empty tanks, and there was something in the young man's expression that Eric had not expected to see there. Not fear, though there was plenty of that. Not grief, though Marcus's death deserved that too. What Eric saw was recognition, the look of one survivor acknowledging another, and beneath that recognition something darker and more complicated, a question that neither of them would ever ask aloud and neither of them would ever be able to answer. They had seen something that no one else would believe, had survived something that no one else could understand, and that knowledge would bind them together for the rest of their lives in a way that was more intimate than friendship and more terrible than any shared trauma. "You felt it too," Raphael said quietly, the words barely audible above the slap of water against the dock. "When we were in that chimney, when the tentacle brushed your ankle, you felt something that wasn't just fear." Eric looked at the young man for a long moment, weighing the cost of honesty against the comfort of silence. "I felt it choose me," he said finally, and the words came out with a flat certainty that surprised him. "I don't know why, I don't know how, but in that moment when the tentacle touched me, I felt something pass between us, something that wasn't just physical contact." Raphael nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "David didn't feel it. I asked him when you were still in the water. He said the tentacle missed him completely, never touched him. Whatever happened in that chamber, it happened to you specifically, and I think you know that. I think you've known it since the moment we broke the surface." Eric didn't answer. There was nothing to say that would make the truth any less terrible or the knowing any less certain. He picked up his bag and walked away from the docks, his feet carrying him toward the beach without any conscious decision on his part. He needed to be away from the others, away from the questions that would eventually come, away from the necessity of pretending that he was processing what had happened in a way that made sense. He needed to be alone with the slime and the vibration and the terrible knowledge that was growing in his chest like a tumor. The beach was empty, the white sand glowing in the last light of the sunset with a purity that seemed almost mocking. Eric dropped his bag and walked to the water's edge, his feet sinking into the wet sand as the tide pulled back from the shore. He found a piece of driftwood, bleached and smooth by years of exposure to sun and salt, and he sat down on the sand with the wood across his knees, and he began to scrub. The motion was frantic, desperate, the same motion that the camera had recorded in the opening minutes of this nightmare. He worked the slime across the grain of the wood with a violence that made his hands ache, scraping the blue film from his skin with the rough surface of the driftwood, watching the wood darken with the substance that came off in thick, viscous smears. But the more he scrubbed, the more the slime seemed to multiply, rising from his pores like sweat, coating his palms and fingers with an iridescence that pulsed in time with the vibration that he could still feel in his teeth and the hollow places behind his eyes. He scrubbed until his hands were raw, until the skin was abraded and bleeding, until the driftwood was stained a deep, unnatural blue that seemed to glow with its own internal light. And still the slime remained, not diminished but somehow strengthened by his efforts, as if the friction and the pain were feeding it rather than removing it. He threw the driftwood aside and plunged his hands into the sand, grinding the grains against his palms with a desperation that bordered on madness, hoping that the abrasive action of a million tiny particles would do what the wood could not. The sand stuck to the slime, forming a paste that covered his hands in a shell of grit and blue phosphorescence, and for a moment Eric felt a surge of hope that was almost as terrible as the despair that had preceded it. He rubbed harder, working the sand into every crease and fold of his skin, watching the paste build up in thick layers that obscured the blue beneath. But when he plunged his hands into the surf to rinse them clean, the sand washed away and the slime remained, untouched and undiminished, pulsing with its patient rhythm as if amused by his efforts. He wasn't cleaning the wood. He was cleaning himself, or trying to, and the effort was as futile as trying to scrub away a tattoo with sand. The slime had become part of him, integrated into his skin at a level that no amount of mechanical abrasion could reach. And as he worked, he began to understand that the driftwood was not the target of his cleaning, had never been the target. The wood was just a surface, a medium, a way of working the substance across his skin in the hope that friction and abrasion would do what soap and water could not. The sun was gone now, the sky deepening into the tropical twilight that lasted only minutes before giving way to full darkness. The stars were emerging, brilliant and indifferent, and the moon was a sliver on the western horizon, too thin to provide more than a ghost of illumination. Eric sat in the gathering dark, still scrubbing, still fighting a battle that he had already lost, and he felt the first tendril of something new enter his consciousness. It was not a thought exactly. It was more like a sensation, a physical awareness that existed somewhere between his skin and his mind, a connection that hummed with the same low-frequency vibration that had accompanied him since his escape from the blue hole. He could feel the creature, or some part of it, some extension of its massive nervous system that had been implanted in him through the medium of the slime. He could feel its patience, its certainty, its absolute confidence that the prey it had marked would eventually return to the water, would eventually surrender to the pull that was already working its way through Eric's body like a slow-acting poison. The sensation grew stronger as the darkness deepened, as if the creature were more present in the night than it had been in the fading light of dusk. Eric could feel its attention focused on him, a pressure that was almost physical in its intensity, like the weight of a hand resting on his shoulder or the breath of something large and hungry stirring the hair at the back of his neck. And beneath that attention, he could feel something else, something that he had not expected and did not know how to process, a kind of recognition, as if the creature were not merely marking him for future consumption but acknowledging him as something more than prey, something closer to kin or student or successor. He stopped scrubbing and looked at his hands in the dim light. The blue luminescence was brighter now, strong enough to cast faint shadows on the sand beneath them, and the rhythm of the pulsing had changed. It was no longer random, no longer merely biological. It was patterned, communicative, a signal being sent and received across a distance that should have been insurmountable, but was somehow as intimate as a whisper. The patterns were complex, beyond his ability to decode in his current state of exhaustion and shock, but he could sense the structure of them, the grammar of a language that operated on principles of pressure and chemistry rather than sound and syntax. Eric stood up, dropping the driftwood onto the sand, and walked to the water's edge. The tide was coming in now, the waves lapping at his ankles with a gentleness that was almost affectionate, almost welcoming. He looked out at the darkness where the blue hole waited, miles away but somehow immediate, somehow present in the water that was touching his skin, carrying its message of patience and hunger and inevitable return. He understood now what the slime was. It was not merely an adhesive, not merely a chemical marker. It was a tether, a biological leash that connected him to the creature in a way that defied everything he knew about marine biology, about nervous systems, about the boundaries between organisms. The Lusca was not just a physical predator. It was something more, something that operated on principles that human science had not yet discovered, perhaps had not yet imagined. And it had chosen him, marked him, claimed him as its own in a way that made his previous understanding of predation seem like child's play. The vibration in his bones was louder now, or perhaps he was simply becoming more attuned to it, learning to hear the frequencies that had been hidden from him before. It was a language, he realized, a form of communication that used pressure and rhythm rather than sound, that spoke directly to the nervous system rather than to the ears. And the message was simple, devastating in its clarity. I am waiting. I am patient. I am always here. Eric turned away from the water and walked back up the beach to where his bag lay in the sand. He found his phone, its screen cracked but functional, and he dialed the number that he had sworn he would never call again. The line rang twice, 3 times, and then a voice answered, the voice of the department chair who had accepted his resignation with such obvious relief. Eric, the voice was surprised, wary, the tone of a man who had thought a problem was solved and was now discovering that it had merely been dormant. It's late. What do you want? I want to come back, Eric said, and his voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man who had made a decision and would not be deterred from it. I want my lab back. I want my funding back. I want everything they took from me after the Bahamas. Eric, we discussed this. The papers were retracted. The data was. The data was right, Eric interrupted, and there was an edge in his voice that made the department chair fall silent. Everything I claimed was true, and I can prove it now. I have proof, physical proof, samples that will change everything we know about marine biology, about evolution, about the limits of life on this planet. What kind of samples? Eric looked at his hands, at the blue glow that pulsed there with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of something miles away in the darkness. The kind that glow in the dark, he said. The kind that don't wash off. The kind that are trying to tell me something, and I'm finally ready to listen. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence of a man weighing possibilities and risks, calculating the return on investment of a decision that could either resurrect a career or bury it deeper than any blue hole. Come to the office tomorrow, the department chair said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Bring your samples. We'll talk. I'll be there, Eric said, and he ended the call before the other man could change his mind. He sat on the beach for a long time after that, watching the stars wheel overhead and feeling the tide rise around his ankles. The slime on his hands continued to pulse, continued to communicate its message of patient hunger, and Eric found that he was no longer afraid of it. Fear was a response to the unknown, to the uncontrollable, and what had begun as unknown was now becoming familiar, becoming comprehensible, becoming something that he could study and classify and ultimately understand. The creature had marked him, yes, but in marking him, it had also given him the key to its own nature. The slime was a biological sample, a piece of tissue that carried the genetic information of the Lusca itself, and if Eric could analyze it, if he could decode the patterns in its luminescence and the chemistry of its adhesion, he could learn things that no marine biologist had ever learned about any organism on Earth. He could unlock the secrets of an apex predator that had survived for millennia in the darkness of the deep, that had evolved strategies of camouflage and predation that made the great white shark look like a clumsy amateur. And perhaps, if he learned enough, if he understood enough, he could find a way to break the connection, to remove the mark, to sever the tether that tied him to the creature's patient hunger and return to a life that was his own, governed by his own will rather than by the rhythmic pull of something that waited in the dark. Or perhaps he would learn that the mark was permanent, that the connection could not be broken, that he was now and forever a part of the Lusca's extended nervous system, a sensory organ that walked on land and would eventually, inevitably, return to the water. Perhaps he would learn that survival was not escape, that the beach was only a temporary respite, that the creature's patience was matched only by its certainty that all things eventually return to the sea. The tide was high now, the water lapping at his calves, and Eric stood up, brushing the sand from his wet suit and gathering his bag. He looked back at the ocean one final time, at the darkness that stretched to the horizon and beyond, and he felt the vibration in his bones match itself to the rhythm of the waves. He walked up the beach toward the lights of the settlement, toward the roads and the airport and the plane that would carry him back to the world of laboratories and conferences, and the slow, patient work of science. Behind him, the ocean breathed in and out with a rhythm that was older than human civilization, and somewhere in the depths, the creature that was the environment waited with a patience that would outlast everything that Eric Vance had ever known or loved. The slime on his hands pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then settled into a steady rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the island itself. Eric did not look back. He kept walking, into the light and the noise and the comforting illusion of human control, carrying the mark of the deep with him like a secret that would eventually have to be told, a debt that would eventually have to be paid, a story that would eventually have to end where it had begun. In the Throat of Andros, where the water was dark and the walls were alive, and the only sound was the patient, eternal thumping of something that had never learned to die. And far below, in the chamber that was not a chamber, the creature that was the environment closed its eye and dreamed of the prey that would return, knowing with the absolute certainty of geological time that the surface was only a temporary condition, that gravity would eventually claim everything that swam, and that the blue hole would drink again soon, very soon, when the mark had done its work, and the tether had drawn its prize back into the dark. The camera still lay on the beach where Eric had left it, its lens pointed toward the stars, its memory card full of footage that would never be shown, testimony to a horror that no one would believe and no one would survive to confirm. The tide was rising, inching closer to the device with each gentle surge, and the sand around it was stained with a faint blue luminescence that pulsed in the darkness like a signal, like a promise, like the heartbeat of an island that had finally found what it had been looking for. And in the morning, when the fishermen came to launch their boats and the tourists came to swim in the shallows, there would be nothing to see but sand and water and the endless blue of a tropical sky. The camera would be gone, washed away by the tide or buried by the sand, and the footage would be lost, and the story would become just another legend, another tale told by old men who refused to enter the water, another warning that the next generation would ignore until it was their turn to discover what waited in the dark. But Eric Vance would remember. He would carry the memory with him like a scar, like a brand, like the mark that pulsed beneath his skin with a rhythm that was not his own. And someday, When the vibration became too loud to ignore and the pull became too strong to resist, he would return to the blue hole, not as a scientist or an explorer, but as a man who had been claimed by something older and hungrier than anything human science had ever named. He would return, and the creature would be waiting, and the cycle would begin again, as it had begun 1,000 times before and would begin 1,000 times again, until the limestone crumbled and the ocean dried, and the last light faded from the last star in the last sky. But that day was not today. Today, Eric Vance was alive, and the mark was quiet, and the sun was warm on his face. He walked away from the beach without looking back, and the ocean watched him go with an eye that was patient and eternal and absolutely certain of its eventual victory. The thumping continued, deep and rhythmic, a heartbeat that matched the pulse of the world itself. And somewhere in the darkness, the creature smiled with a mouth that had never learned to close and waited for the return of the prey that it had already claimed. The Marrow Tide. The needle was crude, fashioned from bone that had been sharpened against stone until it could pierce the tough, rubbery flesh of the whale's skin without splitting it. And the thread was worse, coarse twine that had been braided from hemp fibers and soaked in salt water until it was stiff and rough as cable. The old woman's hands moved with a precision that belied her trembling, drawing the needle through the rotting epidermis with a rhythmic motion that suggested decades of practice. Though Kaido had never seen this particular craft performed in all his years in the village, had never even imagined that such a thing could exist outside the nightmares of the insane. She was sewing the whale skin over the child's eyes, stretching the translucent membrane across the small face with a care that was almost maternal, tacking it down at the temples and the bridge of the nose until the child, a girl of perhaps 6 years, Kaido thought, though it was difficult to tell with the skin covering her features, was blinded completely, her world reduced to the darkness behind the film of decomposing blubber. The child was not struggling. That was the worst part, the detail that Kaido's mind kept returning to as he stood in the doorway of the village shrine and watched the scene unfold with the detached fascination of a man who has stumbled into someone else's delirium. The girl sat perfectly still on the stone bench, her small hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and regular, as if being rendered blind by the skin of a long-dead leviathan were the most natural thing in the world, a routine procedure no more remarkable than having her hair braided or her teeth cleaned. And around her, the rest of the village was screaming. They were screaming in silence. That was the detail that took Kaido longest to process, the element of the scene that his eyes kept reporting to his brain, while his brain kept refusing to accept the testimony. Every adult in the village square was screaming, their faces contorted with expressions of absolute terror, their eyes wide and their cheeks flushed, and their chests heaving with the effort of producing sounds that could not escape. Because their mouths were sewn shut. Each villager, men and women, old and young, the fishermen and the farmers and the shrine keepers who had tended the sacred fires since before Kaido was born, sat or stood or knelt in postures of anguish, their lips sealed with the same coarse twine that the old woman was using on the whale skin, the stitches crude and bloody and unmistakably deliberate. Kaido had been away from Ashima for 10 years. He had left at 19, fleeing the claustrophobia of village life for the anonymity of Tokyo, where no one knew his father's name or his grandmother's face, or the particular shame that clung to his family like the smell of low tide. He had built a life there, small and unremarkable but his own, working in a convenience store and studying photography at a technical college, and learning to sleep through the noise of a city that never truly went dark. He had told himself that he would never return, that the village was a part of his past that he had outgrown like a childhood illness, that the ties that bound him to this place were cords that could be cut with sufficient determination and distance. But the letter had come 3 weeks ago, hand-delivered by a cousin who had found Kaido's address through the family registry, and had made the journey to the city specifically to place the envelope in his hands. The letter was from his uncle, the current head of the family, and it contained only one line of text beyond the formal greetings. Your father is dying. The sea has finally found him. And beneath that, in a different ink and a different hand, as if added as an afterthought or perhaps as a warning that the uncle had not dared to include in the main body, do not look at the water when you arrive. Do not look at the water. Kaido had come because he was 29 years old and he had spent a decade running from a place that he could not stop dreaming about. And because some part of him, some stubborn core of filial obligation that he had never fully managed to excise, believed that a man should see his father before he died, should stand beside the bed and offer the comfort of presence even if the words were inadequate and the feelings were complicated. He had taken the train to the coast and then the ferry to the island, arriving in the late afternoon with a bag on his shoulder and a camera in his pocket and no conception of what he was about to walk into. The village had looked wrong from the moment he crested the hill and saw it spread below him in the valley that ran down to the harbor. It was prosperous, that much was immediately apparent. The houses were freshly painted, the roofs new, the fishing boats in the harbor larger and more modern than anything Kaido remembered from his childhood. The fields were lush with crops that seemed to grow with unnatural speed and density, the rice paddies overflowing with grain that should not have been ready for harvest for another month. The orchards were heavy with fruit that glowed in the fading light, with a richness that seemed almost artificial, as if the trees had been photoshopped by some divine hand that had cranked the saturation slider to maximum. But the prosperity was wrong. Kaido could feel it in his bones before he could articulate it in his mind, a sense of imbalance that made his stomach tighten and his skin prickle with a foreboding that had nothing to do with the letter or the warnings. The colors were too bright, the growth too vigorous, the silence too complete. There were no children playing in the streets, no dogs barking, no radios playing the pop music that had been the soundtrack of his adolescence. The village was full of abundance and empty of life, a stage set dressed for a play that had been canceled, beautiful and sterile and waiting. He had walked down the main street with his bag bumping against his hip, expecting at any moment to be recognized, to be greeted, to be pulled into the web of social obligation that was the defining feature of village life in Japan. But the few people he passed looked through him as if he were transparent, their eyes focusing on some point beyond his shoulder, with an intensity that suggested they were seeing something he could not. They moved with a hurried purposefulness that was at odds with the lazy rhythms of coastal life, rushing from house to house with bundles and boxes, their faces set in expressions of grim determination that Kaido associated with city commuters rather than island fishermen. And then he had reached the shrine and seen the square, and witnessed the scene that would redefine his understanding of what was possible in the world. "Don't stare," a voice said behind him, and Kaido turned to find an old man standing in the shadows of the shrine gate, his face half hidden by the straw hat that shaded his eyes from the last rays of the sun. It was Elder Tanaka, the oldest surviving member of the village council, a man who had been ancient when Kaido was a child and who seemed somehow to have grown younger in the intervening years, his skin smoother and his posture straighter than Kaido remembered. "It's rude to stare at someone's preparations." "Preparations," Kaido managed, his voice cracking on the word. "Elder Tanaka, what is happening here? Why are their mouths sewn shut? Why is that woman blinding that child?" The old man's expression shifted, something passing behind his eyes that Kaido could not read. "You came back," he said, as if this were an answer to the question rather than a deflection. "Your uncle said you would not. He said the city had swallowed you, that you were lost to us." "I came back because my father is dying. I came back to say goodbye. But Elder Tanaka, please, what is happening in this village?" Tanaka stepped forward, his hand closing on Kaido's wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong, the fingers like iron bands around the younger man's flesh. "You should not have come," he said quietly, and there was genuine sorrow in his voice, a grief that was deeper and older than the immediate horror of the scene in the square. The debt is almost paid. One more generation, perhaps two, and the balance would have been restored. But you are of the blood, Kaido. You are of the blood, and the blood is what the sea remembers. What debt? Kaido pulled his wrist free, stepping back from the old man's grip. What are you talking about? What happened here? Tanaka looked at him for a long moment, weighing something in his mind that Kaido could not see. Then he sighed, a sound like wind through dry grass, and gestured toward the path that led down to the harbor. "Walk with me," he said. "I will show you what your father did. I will show you what we all did. And then you will understand why the child must be blinded, and why we must be silent, and why the rain that is coming will be the last rain that this village ever sees." They walked down to the water in a silence that was broken only by the slap of waves against the pilings, and the distant cry of gulls that seemed to be circling somewhere overhead, though Kaido could not see them against the bright sky. The harbor was full of fish, more fish than Kaido had ever seen in his life, piled in crates and baskets that overflowed with catches so large and numerous that they seemed to defy the laws of marine biology. The tuna were the size of small cars, their blue-black bodies gleaming with a freshness that suggested they had been caught only hours before. The squid were enormous, their tentacles coiled in bundles that were larger than a man's torso. And mixed in with the ordinary catches were things that Kaido did not recognize, fish with too many eyes or too few fins, creatures that seemed to have been pulled from depths that no net should have been able to reach. 20 years ago, Tanaka said, his voice carrying the flat cadence of a story that had been told too many times, a whale beached itself on the eastern shore. It was ancient, the oldest any of us had ever seen, with barnacles on its barnacles and scars that told of battles with creatures we could not imagine. It was dying when it came ashore, its breathing labored, its eye. There was only one eye, the other lost to some encounter in the deep, fixed on the village with an intelligence that made the old women weep and the old men cross themselves against evil. A whale beached itself, Kaido repeated, and he felt the first stirrings of memory, fragments of stories that his father had told him when he was very small, before the silence had fallen between them, before the city had become Kaido's answer to everything the village represented. "I remember. I was 9 years old. My father went with the others to help it back into the water." "Your father went with the others," Tanaka agreed, "but they did not help it back into the water. The whale was dying, Kaido. It was past saving. And in their grief or their greed or their desperate fear of what the whale's death would mean for the village's luck, the men of Ashima made a decision that has cost us everything we ever valued. They decided to harvest the whale before it died. They decided to take its meat and its oil and its bones while it still lived, to carve it up like a fish on a cutting board, to profit from its death before the sea could claim it." Kaido stopped walking, his feet refusing to carry him further until his mind had processed what the old man was saying. "They butchered a living whale." "They butchered a living whale," Tanaka confirmed, and his voice carried the weight of a confession that had been repeated for 2 decades without ever becoming easier to speak. "They bypassed the burial rites. They ignored the prayers that should have been offered to send the whale's spirit back to the deep. They took everything, the meat, the blubber, the oil, the bones, and they left the skeleton to rot in the shallows where the tide could reach it but the depths could not reclaim it. And the sea, Kaido, the sea saw what they did. The sea remembers." They had reached the end of the harbor, where the breakwater gave way to the rocky shore that curved around to the eastern beach. And there, visible even from this distance, Kaido could see it, the skeleton. It was massive, larger than any whale skeleton he had ever seen in a museum, a cathedral of bone that rose from the water like the ribs of some impossible shipwreck. The bones were bleached white by decades of sun and salt, but they were intact, perfectly preserved, arranged in the shape of the animal they had once supported with a precision that suggested care rather than neglect. "We tried to move it," Tanaka said, following Kaido's gaze. In the first years after the misfortunes began, we tried to drag it into deeper water to give it the burial that had been denied it. But the skeleton would not move. It was as if it had rooted itself in the seabed, grown into the rock, become a part of the island itself. And every year it has grown larger, or perhaps we have only grown smaller, our perspective shifting until what seemed like a skeleton now seems like a monument, a warning, a promise. Kaido stared at the bones, feeling the first cold touch of understanding creep into his chest. The prosperity, he said slowly, the fish, the crops, it's all connected to the skeleton, isn't it? The sea is feeding us, fattening us, preparing us for something. The sea does not forget a debt, Tanaka said, and his voice was barely audible above the wind that was beginning to rise from the east, carrying with it the smell of rain and something else. Something that Kaido could not identify, but that made his stomach twist with a primitive revulsion. And the debt is collected in bone. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the skeleton and the water that lapped around it with a gentleness that was almost affectionate, almost hungry. And then Kaido saw the first of the ghost fish. It emerged from the tide pool at his feet, rising through the clear water with a motion that was too slow, too deliberate, to be the movement of a living creature. It was translucent, its body like glass or gel, and through its skin Kaido could see the architecture of its organs, the heart, the liver, the thread of intestine, all suspended in the fluid of its body like specimens in a jar. But it had no eyes. Where the eyes should have been, there were only smooth sockets of scaled flesh, blank and white and terrible in their completeness. And it was not alone. As Kaido watched, frozen in place by a horror that he could not yet name, more of the creatures emerged from the pools and the shallows, dozens of them, hundreds, their eyeless bodies clustering around the ankles of the villagers who had begun to gather at the water's edge, drawn by some instinct that Kaido did not share and did not want to understand. The ghost fish circled the humans with a motion that was almost ceremonial, almost reverent, and Kaido understood with a certainty that went beyond reason that these were not creatures of the living sea. These were messengers, harbingers, the advance guard of something that was coming and could not be stopped. "They've been here for 3 days, Tanaka said quietly. "Since the first rains began. They circle us constantly, waiting, watching with eyes they do not have, and every day there are more of them. Every day the circle tightens." Kaido looked up from the ghost fish and saw the sky, and what he saw there made him forget the creatures at his feet, made him forget the skeleton on the shore, made him forget everything except the overwhelming impossibility of what he was witnessing. The birds were not flying. They were hovering, thousands of them, a living ceiling of black feathers that covered the entire sky from horizon to horizon, their wings beating so rapidly that they blurred into a continuous hum that vibrated in Kaido's teeth and the hollow spaces behind his eyes. They were frigate birds and gulls and terns and cormorants, every species that lived on or near the island, and they were all frozen in place, suspended in the air as if the sky itself had become a solid surface that they could rest upon. "The birds came this morning," Tanaka said, and his voice was flat, resigned, the voice of a man who had already accepted the ending of his story and was simply waiting for the final pages to be written. "They arrived with the dawn, all of them at once, and they have not moved since. They do not eat. They do not call. They simply hover, waiting for the signal that will release them." "What signal?" Kaido asked, but he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. "The signal that the debt is being collected," Tanaka said. "The signal that the Bake Kujira has come for what we owe." The rain began then, a light drizzle that fell from a sky that was otherwise clear, the droplets warm and thick with a smell that was not quite salt and not quite fresh water but something in between, something that carried the mineral tang of deep water and the organic richness of decomposing flesh. Kaido felt the first drops on his face and instinctively raised his hand to wipe them away. And when he looked at his palm, he saw that the water was not clear but faintly cloudy, tinged with a pinkish hue that suggested blood diluted beyond recognition. "The rain," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Marrow Tide," Tanaka corrected. "The sea does not send ordinary water to collect its debts. It sends the tide that carries the essence of what was stolen, the fluid of life that we took from the whale, and that must now be returned to the whale. Every drop that falls is a reminder of what we did. Every drop that soaks into the ground is a promise of what is coming." They stood in the rain as it strengthened around them, the drizzle becoming a shower, and the shower becoming a downpour that soaked their clothes in seconds and ran in rivulets down their faces and into their mouths. Kaido tasted it, the strange metallic sweetness of the water, and he felt something shift in his understanding of the world, some fundamental assumption about the nature of reality crumbling under the weight of evidence that could not be denied. The elder turned to face him, water streaming from the brim of his straw hat and running in rivers down the creases of his face. "You must be prepared," he said, and his voice was urgent now, stripped of the resignation that had characterized it before. "You are of the blood, Kaido. You are the son of the man who led the butchery. The Bake Kujira will know you. It will seek you out. And when it comes, you must not look at it. You must not speak of it. You must cover your eyes and seal your mouth and hope that the whale's anger passes over you like a wave breaking on a rock." "I don't understand," Kaido said, and his voice was shaking, his composure finally cracking under the accumulated weight of impossible images. "What is the Bake Kujira? What does it want?" "The Bake Kujira is the skeleton," Tanaka said. "And the skeleton is the Bake Kujira. It is the ghost of the whale we killed, the spirit of the Leviathan that we denied its proper rest. It does not want revenge, Kaido. Revenge would be simple, clean, comprehensible. What it wants is balance. It wants the marrow that we stole. It wants the bones that we broke. It wants the life that we took and twisted into this obscene prosperity. And when it comes, it will not stop until the debt is paid in full." The rain was torrential now, a wall of water that reduced visibility to a few meters and turned the harbor into a churning cauldron of whitecaps and spray. Kaido wiped his eyes and squinted into the downpour, and through the veil of water, he saw something that made him forget to breathe, forget to think, forget everything except the absolute certainty that he was about to die. The skeleton was moving. Not the skeleton on the shore, that remained where it had been, a white monument to human greed and cruelty. But out in the harbor, beyond the breakwater where the water was deepest and darkest, something was rising from the depths. It was white, impossibly white, the white of bone that has been polished by centuries of pressure and current, until it gleamed like ivory or porcelain or the surface of the moon. And it was enormous, larger than any living whale, larger than any ship that had ever anchored in these waters, a structure of ribs and vertebrae and skull that moved through the water with a grace that was horrifying in its delicacy, its bones articulating in ways that no skeleton should be able to move, swimming through the solid water as if it were as fluid as the air. The Bake Kujira had arrived. It did not attack. It did not roar or thrash or display any of the aggressive behaviors that Kaido would have associated with a predator. It simply existed in the harbor, its massive form displacing the water in waves that rocked the fishing boats and sent them crashing against the pilings with a violence that snapped mooring lines and splintered hulls. The ghost fish swarmed around it, their eyeless bodies darting between the ribs with a speed that suggested joy or worship, or some emotion that had no name in human language. And the birds above, the birds began to descend, dropping from their frozen positions in the sky to circle the skeleton in a vortex of black feathers that spiraled downward like water draining from a tub, their cries finally audible and terrible in their intensity. "Don't look," Tanaka whispered, but his own eyes were fixed on the skeleton, and Kaido could see the tears mixing with the rain on the old man's cheeks. "Don't look at it, Kaido. Cover your eyes now." But Kaido could not look away. The Bake Kujira was beautiful. in the way that glaciers and volcanic eruptions and other forces of nature were beautiful, terrifying and absolute, and utterly indifferent to the survival of the creatures that witnessed it. The skull was the size of a house, the eye sockets empty caverns that seemed to stare directly into Kaido's soul with a gaze that was not blind but all-seeing, not empty, but full of a consciousness that had evolved beyond the need for physical organs. The ribs curved upward like the arches of a cathedral, creating a space within the skeleton that was large enough to contain the entire village. And as Kaido watched, he saw something moving in that space, something that was not bone and not water but something else entirely, a mist or a shadow or a memory of the flesh that had once covered those bones. "It's not real," Kaido heard himself say, and the words were a prayer rather than a statement of fact. "It's not real, it's a hallucination. The rain, the stress, the shock of coming back." "It's real," Tanaka said, and his voice was hollow, emptied of everything except the bare acknowledgement of what they were witnessing. "And it's only the beginning." The village's bravest hunters had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion and the instinct to defend their homes that overrode even the terror that had kept them indoors. They carried harpoons, the traditional weapons of the Ashima whalers, iron-tipped lances that had been in their families for generations, and that had been used to kill more whales than Kaido could count. They ran to the end of the breakwater, their bodies silhouetted against the white mass of the skeleton, and they threw their weapons with the skill of men who had been trained from childhood in the art of the hunt. The harpoons passed through the ribs like smoke. Kaido watched with a disbelief that bordered on madness as the iron spears, each one heavy enough to kill a man at 50 meters, struck the Bake Kujira's framework and continued through without resistance, as if the bones were projections of light rather than solid matter. The hunters stumbled forward with the momentum of their throws, carried by their own strength into the space that the skeleton occupied, and for a moment they were inside it, surrounded by the ribs that towered above them like the pillars of some impossible temple. And then the harpoons that had passed through the skeleton found their targets, not the whale, but the wooden pilings of the breakwater, the stone walls of the harbor buildings, the bodies of the hunters themselves. One man screamed as his own weapon emerged from a rib and buried itself in his shoulder, the iron tip punching through muscle and bone with a force that spun him around and sent him crashing to the wet stone. Another stumbled backward, clutching his stomach where a stray harpoon had found him, the blood mixing with the rain in a pink wash that ran down his legs and into the harbor. The remaining hunters retreated, dropping their weapons and running for the safety of the village with a speed that suggested they had never truly believed their weapons would work, that the hunt had been an act of desperation rather than courage, a final gesture of defiance before the inevitable end. And through it all, the Bake Kujira continued to swim in its slow, stately circle around the harbor, its bones grinding against each other with a sound like millstones, like glaciers calving, like the earth itself shifting on its axis. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, a bass note so low that Kaido felt it in his sternum rather than hearing it with his ears, and the rhythm matched the pulsing of the rain and the beating of his own heart until he could no longer distinguish between them, until his body and the skeleton and the sea had become a single organism, vibrating in perfect synchronization. "What do we do?" Kaido asked, and his voice was barely audible above the rain and the grinding bones and the screams of the wounded. "Elder Tanaka, what do we do?" "We wait," Tanaka said, and his eyes were fixed on the skeleton with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite resignation but something in between, something that Kaido would later recognize as the acceptance of a fate that could not be altered, only endured. "We wait for the tide to turn. We wait for the whale to take what it wants, and we pray that when it is finished, there will be enough of us left to bury the dead." The rain intensified, becoming a deluge that blurred the boundaries between sea and sky, between the living and the dead, between the world that Kaido had known and the world that was now revealing itself in all its terrible glory. The Bake Kujira completed its circuit of the harbor and turned toward the shore, its massive skull orienting toward the village with a precision that suggested intention, intelligence, memory. And as Kaido watched, frozen in place by a horror that transcended anything he had ever imagined in his darkest moments, the skeleton began to rise from the water, its bones dripping with phosphorescence that glowed in the rain with a light that was not natural, not biological, but something that belonged to the realm of spirits and curses and the ancient laws that governed the relationship between the living and the dead. "Run," Tanaka whispered, and the word was so quiet that Kaido almost missed it, almost let it be swallowed by the storm. "Run, Kaido, run and don't look back. The debt is being collected, and the collectors do not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. They take what the sea demands, and they take it in bone." But Kaido did not run. He stood his ground, his feet rooted to the stone by a combination of terror and fascination, and the terrible suspicion that running would be futile, that the Bake Kujira's reach extended far beyond the harbor, far beyond the island, far beyond any distance that human legs could cover in a human lifetime. He watched the skeleton approach the shore, its bones grinding and shifting with a sound that was now almost deafening, and he felt the first stirrings of a transformation that he could not yet understand, but would soon know with an intimacy that would destroy everything he had ever believed about himself. The ossification had begun. It started in his fingers, a tingling that was not quite pain and not quite numbness, but something that existed in the space between, a sensation of pressure and heat that spread from his fingertips up through his hands and into his wrists with a speed that suggested chemical reaction rather than biological process. He looked down at his hands and saw that the skin was changing, the normal pinkish tone fading to a paler hue that reminded him of candle wax or fresh plaster. The texture was changing too, the soft give of living tissue hardening into something smooth and rigid, something that did not flex or fold, but held its shape with a brittle certainty that was as terrible as it was beautiful. "No," he whispered, but the word came out strange, distorted by lips that were beginning to stiffen, to lose their suppleness, to transform into something that was not quite flesh and not quite stone but a hybrid of both, a porcelain mask that covered the face beneath with a layer of calcium-white permanence. "The sickness of the marrow," Tanaka said, and his voice was thick with the same transformation, his own skin beginning to glow with the faint luminescence of bone in moonlight. "It begins with the extremities and moves inward. The whale is not hunting us, Kaido. It is claiming us. It is turning us into what it needs us to be, a reef of bone to accompany its own lonely skeleton, a congregation of statues to fill the silence of the deep." Kaido tried to move, to run, to do anything that would break the spell that was falling over him like the rain, like the skeleton's shadow, like the weight of a debt that he had not incurred, but that he was nevertheless required to pay. But his legs would not obey him. His feet were becoming heavy with the same calcification that was consuming his hands, and he understood with a clarity that was almost mathematical in its precision that the transformation was not optional, not conditional, not something that could be resisted through willpower or prayer or any of the other tools that humans used to pretend they had control over their destinies. The Bake Kujira was claiming the village, one body at a time, one bone at a time, turning the living into monuments that would stand on the shore forever, frozen in the attitudes of their final moments, preserved in calcium like insects in amber. And Kaido, the son of the man who had led the butchery, was not exempt from this collection. He was, if anything, the primary target, the focus of the whale's anger, the vessel into which all the accumulated debt of his father's sin was being poured. He fell to his knees on the wet stone, his body heavy with the weight of the transformation, his mind racing through possibilities and escape routes and desperate plans that dissolved as quickly as they formed. The rain ran down his face and into his eyes, and through the blur of water and tears he saw the Bake Kujira looming above him, its skull blocking out the sky, its empty eye sockets filled with a darkness that was deeper and older than any ocean trench. "I didn't do this," Kaido whispered, and his voice was barely audible, barely human, the voice of a man who was becoming something else. "I wasn't here. I didn't kill the whale." "But you are of the blood," a voice answered, and it was not Tanaka's voice, not any human voice, but something that came from everywhere and nowhere, from the rain and the bones and the deep vibration that was now the only sound in the world. "And the blood is what the sea remembers. The blood is what the sea claims." The skeleton reached for him, its bones parting like curtains to reveal the space within, the hollow where the heart had once beaten and the stomach had once digested, and the brain had once dreamed of the endless dark. And Kaido understood in the last moment before the transformation was complete that the Bake Kujira was not empty. It was full of the souls of the villagers who had already been claimed, full of the spirits of the generations who had fed the whale's hunger with their own bodies, full of a presence that was not vengeful but was nevertheless absolute, not cruel but was nevertheless final. He opened his mouth to scream, but his jaw was locked now. His lips fused into a mask of calcium that would never speak again, never breathe again, never do anything except stand on the shore and wait for the tide to rise and the cycle to begin again. The rain stopped. The birds flew away. The ocean settled into a calm that was perfect and terrible in its completeness. And on the shore of Ashima, where the village had once stood, there was now only a reef of white stone pillars, perfectly preserved, eternally patient, waiting for the next traveler to pass by and wonder at the beauty of the coral that grew in such strange human shapes. The Bake Kujira returned to the deep, carrying its new congregation with it, the bones of the villagers snapping and fusing into its framework to replace the flesh it had lost, to fill the emptiness that had driven it ashore in search of what had been taken from it. And the sea, which never forgets and never forgives, closed over the skeleton with a gentleness that was almost maternal, almost loving, hiding the evidence of its justice beneath layers of water and time, and the slow, patient forgetting that is the only mercy the ocean ever offers. Kaido stood on the shore, his body a statue of calcium-white stone, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the whale had disappeared, his mouth forever open in a scream that would never be heard. He was not dead, not exactly. The transformation had preserved his consciousness, his awareness, his terrible knowledge of what had happened and why. He would stand here for centuries, feeling the tide rise and fall around his ankles, feeling the sun and the rain and the slow erosion of wind against his stone face, feeling everything except the ability to move, to speak, to end the suffering that was his reward for being of the blood. And somewhere in the deep, the Bake Kujira swam on, its skeleton now heavier by the weight of a village, its emptiness now filled by the marrow of the guilty and the innocent alike. It did not hate. It did not love. It simply was and would be, until the debt was paid and the balance restored, and the sea finally consented to forget what had been done in the name of greed and fear, and the desperate hunger of men who had looked at a dying god and seen only meat. The silence of the shore was absolute, broken only by the gentle lap of waves against stone and the distant cry of a single gull, circling overhead in a sky that was now empty of everything except the endless blue of a world that had moved on, that had forgotten, that would never remember the village of Ashima, or the man who had returned to it too late to save anyone, including himself. And in the calcium-white statue that had been Kaido, the consciousness that remained watched and waited and endured, knowing with a certainty that transcended time that the tide would turn again, that the debt would come due again, and that the sea, which was older than sin and more patient than death, would always find a way to collect what was owed. The house that had been Kaido's childhood home smelled wrong. It was not the wrongness of neglect or decay. The building was immaculate, the floors polished, the screens repaired, the altar freshly supplied with rice and sake, and the small offerings that his mother had always insisted upon. But beneath the familiar sense of cedar and tatami and the faint lingering aroma of his father's pipe tobacco, there was something else, something that Kaido's nose could not identify, but his body recognized with a primal revulsion that made his stomach clench and his skin prickle with a foreboding that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It smelled of the deep. It smelled of pressure and darkness and the organic chemistry of things that had never seen the sun. It smelled, more than anything else, of the whale. His father was upstairs, lying in the room that had been his parents' bedroom for 40 years, and Kaido climbed the narrow stairs with feet that felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had not just witnessed the impossible and was now expected to behave as if the world had not changed. The elder Tanaka had left him at the door, muttering something about preparations that needed to be made, about doors that needed to be barred and windows that needed to be sealed, as if any of those things could stop a skeleton the size of a cathedral from doing what it had come to do. The bedroom was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that flickered on the low table beside the futon, and in the uncertain light his father looked like a stranger, like a man who had been replaced by something that wore his face but had never lived his life. Kenji Nakamura had been a large man in Kaido's memory, broad-shouldered and strong-armed, a fisherman who could haul a net full of tuna onto the deck without help, and who had once, according to village legend, fought off a shark with nothing but a gaff hook in his bare hands. But the man who lay on the futon now was shrunken, diminished, his body wasted by a disease that had consumed him from the inside out, until he was little more than a skeleton himself, a framework of bones draped with skin that had the texture and color of old parchment. "Kaido," his father whispered, and the voice was barely audible, a rasp of breath across vocal cords that had been eaten away by the same process that had consumed his flesh. "You came back. I told them not to write. I told them to let you live." "I'm here," Kaido said, kneeling beside the futon and taking his father's hand, feeling the bones beneath the skin with a clarity that made him want to pull away. "Father, what is happening to you? What is happening to this village?" "The debt," Kenji whispered, and his eyes, which had been closed, opened suddenly, revealing pupils that were not black but white, the white of bone, the white of the skeleton in the harbor. "The debt is being collected. I led them to the whale, Kaido. I was the one who said we should take what it offered. I was the one who said the sea had given us a gift and we would be fools not to accept it. And now the sea wants its gift back, with interest paid in bone." Kaido felt his father's hand tighten on his, the fingers curling with a strength that was unexpected, almost painful. "You're sick," he said, and his voice was thick with the helplessness of a child who has discovered that his parents are mortal after all. "We need to get you to a hospital. There are doctors on the mainland who can." "No doctors," Kenji interrupted, and there was a fierceness in his voice that belied his wasted body. "No hospitals, no medicines. What is happening to me is not disease, Kaido. It is justice. It is the sea reclaiming what was stolen. Look at my skin. Look at it closely." Kaido looked, and what he saw made him want to scream, made him want to run from the room and never return, made him want to unsee what his eyes were showing him. His father's skin was not merely pale or wasted. It was transforming. The surface had taken on a sheen that was not quite natural, a glossiness that reminded Kaido of porcelain or polished marble, or the calcium deposits that formed on bones left in the sun. And beneath the sheen, he could see the structure of the underlying tissue changing, the soft flesh hardening into something rigid and crystalline, the muscles becoming strands of mineral rather than bundles of fiber. "The ossification," Kenji said, and his voice carried a terrible pride, as if he were presenting a scientific discovery rather than describing his own death. "It begins in the extremities and moves inward. The fingers first, then the toes, then the limbs, then the torso. The organs are the last to go. The heart keeps beating long after it should have stopped, long after the brain has turned to stone. The sea wants us conscious, Kaido. It wants us aware. That is the punishment for what we did. Not death, but eternal consciousness in a body that cannot move, cannot speak, cannot do anything except feel and remember and regret. "Father," Kaido whispered, and the word was barely a breath, barely a sound, the last syllable of a prayer that had no God to receive it. "The oil," Kenji said suddenly, his grip tightening further, the fingers like claws around Kaido's wrist. "In the cellar, the forbidden oil. I kept it, Kaido. All these years I kept it. We were supposed to burn it, to pour it back into the sea as an offering, but I couldn't. I was greedy. I was afraid. I thought that as long as we had the whale's oil, we would have the whale's luck. And I was right. We did have its luck. We had 20 years of prosperity that no other village could match. But luck is only a loan, and the interest is always higher than the principal." "What oil?" Kaido asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. "The whale oil," Kenji whispered, and his eyes were closing again, the white pupils rolling back beneath parchment-thin lids. "From the butchery. The finest grade, the sacred oil that should have been returned to the deep. I kept it in the cellar in the old casks, and I used it to light this house for 20 years. Every lantern, every lamp, every candle, they all burned with the whale's stolen life. And as long as the flame consumed the oil, the whale was tethered to us. It couldn't return to the deep because a part of it was still here, burning, giving us light and warmth, and the illusion that we were safe." Kaido pulled his hand free from his father's grip and stood up, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just heard. The prosperity was not a gift. It was a lure, a fattening of the livestock before the slaughter. The whale oil was not a blessing but a chain, an anchor that held the Bake Kujira to the village's shores, that prevented it from finding rest in the deep and forced it to remain in the shallows, growing hungrier and angrier with each passing year. And now the debt was being called, and the only way to pay it was with the marrow of the villagers themselves. He left his father lying on the futon and went downstairs, his feet carrying him toward the cellar door with a mechanical inevitability that suggested his body knew things his mind had not yet accepted. The cellar was dark, the air thick with the smell of earth and age and something else, something that Kaido now recognized as the concentrated essence of the whale, the distilled ghost of the Leviathan that had been denied its rest. He found the oil lamp on the shelf beside the door and lit it with trembling hands, and the flame that emerged was not yellow or orange but blue, a cold phosphorescence that cast no warmth and threw shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects that created them. The casks were at the back of the cellar, hidden behind crates of preserved vegetables and the fishing nets that had not been used in years. There were 6 of them, ancient wooden barrels bound with iron hoops that had rusted to the color of dried blood, and each one was stamped with the mark of the Ashima whalers, the crossed harpoons that had once been a symbol of pride and were now a mark of shame. Kaido pried open the lid of the nearest cask and looked inside, and what he saw made him gag, made him stumble backward and press his hand against his mouth to keep from vomiting. The oil was not oil anymore, or at least not the clear golden liquid that Kaido remembered from his childhood, the precious commodity that had fueled the lamps of the village and warmed the hearths of the fishermen's homes. It had transformed into something else, something that was part liquid and part solid, and part something that defied categorization. It pulsed with its own internal light, a faint blue luminescence that matched the flame of the lamp and the glow of the skeleton in the harbor. And as Kaido watched, it moved, coiling and uncoiling in the darkness of the cask like a living thing, like a tentacle, like a tongue tasting the air for prey. He slammed the lid back onto the cask and backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that made his vision blur and his ears ring. The oil was alive, or at least it was animated by something that was indistinguishable from life, and it was waiting, patient and hungry, and absolutely certain that sooner or later someone would come to consume it. Because that was the nature of the debt. The whale had been consumed, and now the consumers would be consumed in turn, transformed into the very thing they had stolen, their bodies becoming oil and bone and the endless darkness of the deep. He climbed the stairs back to the main floor and stood in the kitchen, listening to the rain that was still falling outside and the grinding of bones that was coming from the harbor. And he understood with a clarity that was almost mathematical in its precision that the village was doomed. Not because of the skeleton in the water, not because of the ghost fish or the hovering birds or the rain that smelled of blood and marrow, but because of the oil in the cellar, because of the greed that had kept the whale tethered to the shore, because of the chain of cause and effect that had been set in motion 20 years ago and was now reaching its inevitable conclusion. The door burst open and Tanaka stumbled through, his clothes soaked and his face pale with a terror that Kaido had not seen in him even during the worst moments of the harbor spectacle. "It's moving," the old man gasped, his chest heaving with the effort of running through the downpour. "The Bake Kujira, it's not staying in the water." "What do you mean?" Kaido demanded, though some part of him already knew. Some part of him had already seen this possibility in the geometry of the skeleton's bones, in the way it had moved through the water with a grace that suggested it was not bound by the same physical laws as ordinary matter. "It's coming ashore," Tanaka said, and his voice was barely a whisper, the voice of a man who has used up his last reserves of courage and is now running on nothing but terror. "The skeleton, it's climbing out of the harbor. It's moving across the land." Kaido ran to the window and looked out, and what he saw confirmed the old man's words with a visual clarity that made denial impossible. The Bake Kujira was indeed moving, but not in the way that any living creature would move. It was not walking or crawling or slithering. It was swimming through the earth itself, its massive bones carving through soil and rock, and the foundations of houses as if the ground were liquid, as if the solid land were no more substantial to the ghost whale than the water it had inhabited moments before. The ribs rose and fell in a rhythmic motion that suggested propulsion, some impossible form of locomotion that operated on principles Kaido could not comprehend. And as the skeleton moved, it left a trench behind it, a furrow in the earth that was filling with rainwater and becoming a river of mud and debris. "We have to evacuate," Kaido said, turning back to Tanaka with an urgency that he felt in his gut rather than his mind. "We have to get everyone out of the village up into the hills, away from the water and the skeleton and whatever is driving it." "We've tried," Tanaka said, and his voice was hollow, emptied of everything except the bare facts of their situation. "The first families left an hour ago, when the skeleton began to move. They took the road that leads to the ferry terminal, the road that climbs into the interior of the island." "But the Bake Kujira is circling the village, Kaido. It's not just coming ashore, it's surrounding us. Its ribs are carving through the earth on every side, creating a wall of bone that traps us inside. There is no escape." Kaido looked out the window again, and this time he saw what Tanaka was describing. The skeleton was indeed moving in a circle, its massive form navigating around the perimeter of the village with a precision that suggested intelligence, strategy, patience. The ribs that emerged from the earth were like the bars of a cage, white and impassable and growing higher with each circuit, as if the whale were not merely surrounding the village but constricting it, tightening its grip like a python around prey that had already been subdued. And within the circle, the villagers were running, their mouths still sewn shut, their eyes wide with a panic that could find no outlet in speech or scream, their bodies stumbling through the rain and the mud and the ever-tightening spiral of bone. "The children," Kaido said suddenly, remembering the girl in the square, the child whose eyes had been covered with rotting whale skin. "What about the children?" "The blind ones are safe," Tanaka said, and there was a terrible logic in his words. "The whale skin protects them. The Bake Kujira cannot see them, cannot claim them as long as they carry the mark of the whale on their faces. But the others, the ones who can see, the ones who can speak, they are being collected. They are being chosen." Chosen for what? To replace the flesh that was lost, Tanaka said, and his voice carried the weight of a knowledge that he had carried for 20 years, a secret that had eaten away at his soul like the oil had eaten away at the casks in the cellar. The Bake Kujira is a skeleton, Kaido. It has no flesh, no organs, no blood. It is only bone, memory, hunger, and what it wants, what it has always wanted, is to be whole again, to have a body, to have a form that can swim and hunt and live in the deep, and the only way for it to become whole is to take flesh from somewhere else, to take it from us. The grinding of bones grew louder, closer, and Kaido felt the floor beneath his feet begin to vibrate with the rhythm of the skeleton's passage. The house shook, the timbers groaning under the pressure of something massive moving through the earth nearby, and Kaido understood with perfect clarity that they were standing in the path of destruction, that the Bake Kujira's circle was contracting and would soon crush everything within it. "We need to get to the shrine," he said, grabbing Tanaka's arm and pulling the old man toward the door. "The shrine is stone, it's solid, it might withstand." "Nothing withstands," Tanaka said, but he was following Kaido, his feet moving with the mechanical compliance of a man who has given up hope but has not yet found the courage to lie down and die. "Nothing withstands the sea. Nothing withstands the debt." They ran through the rain, Kaido supporting the old man with one arm while his other hand shielded his eyes from the downpour. And all around them, the village was dissolving into chaos. Houses were collapsing as the skeleton's ribs carved through their foundations, walls folding inward like paper lanterns in a storm, roofs sliding off into the mud with crashes that were swallowed by the grinding of bone. The villagers were running in every direction, their sewn mouths making them silent participants in their own destruction, their bodies falling into the trenches that the skeleton was carving, the mud rising around them like quicksand, the bones of the Bake Kujira passing through their flesh without resistance and emerging on the other side, stained with blood and tissue. Kaido saw a woman he recognized from his childhood, the mother of a friend who had died in a fishing accident when they were both 12, her body caught between two ribs of the skeleton as it passed through her garden. She did not scream. She could not scream, but her eyes met Kaido's with a clarity that transcended language, a message of terror and accusation, and the desperate plea for rescue that he could not fulfill. And then the rib moved, sliding through her torso like a knife through warm butter, and she was gone, her body collapsing into the trench that the skeleton had left, the blood mixing with the rain and the mud until there was nothing left to mark her passing except the memory in Kaido's mind. They reached the shrine and stumbled inside, collapsing against the wall as the building shook around them, the stone foundations groaning under the pressure of the earth being displaced by the massive bones. Through the open door, Kaido could see the circle tightening, the ribs drawing closer with each pass, the space within the cage growing smaller and smaller until it would be only a matter of minutes before there was no space left at all, before the skeleton had compressed the village into a single point of absolute density from which nothing could escape. "There has to be a way," Kaido gasped, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing in air that seemed to have grown thick with moisture and fear. "There has to be something we can do, some ritual, some offering, some prayer that can stop this." "The burial rites," Tanaka said, and his voice was barely audible above the grinding of bones and the crash of collapsing buildings. "The proper burial rites. They were never performed. If they had been performed, if the whale had been given its proper rest, the Bake Kujira would have found peace and returned to the deep. But we skipped them. We were greedy. We were in a hurry. We thought the old ways were superstition, that the prayers were empty words, that the sea was just water and the whale was just meat. And now we are paying for that arrogance with everything we have." "Then we perform them now," Kaido said, and the words came out with a determination that surprised him, a refusal to surrender that rose from some deep reserve of stubbornness that he had inherited from generations of fishermen who had faced the sea and survived. "We perform the rites now, and we offer the whale what it wants, and we pray that it's not too late. It's too late, Tanaka said. The rites must be performed with purity of heart and purity of hands. They cannot be performed by the guilty. And we are all guilty, Kaido. Every one of us who ate the whale's meat, who burned the whale's oil, who prospered from the whale's death. We are all guilty, and the Bake Kujira knows it. Then I will perform them, Kaido said, and he stood up, his legs steady beneath him for the first time since he had arrived in the village, his mind clear with a purpose that transcended fear. I was 9 years old. I did not kill the whale. I did not eat its meat. I have been away for 10 years, living in the city, eating food that had nothing to do with this village or its sins. If anyone is innocent, it is me. And if innocence is what is required, then let me be the one who tries. Tanaka looked at him with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite despair, but something in between, something that Kaido would later recognize as the last flicker of belief in a world that had already ended. The shrine, the old man said, pointing toward the inner chamber where the sacred objects were kept. The burial rites require the whale bone whistle, the prayer scrolls, the offering of salt and sake. They are all there in the cabinet behind the altar. But Kaido, even if you perform the rites perfectly, even if every word is correct and every gesture precise, the Bake Kujira may not accept. It does not want a prayer. It wants the marrow. It wants the bone. It wants the flesh that we stole from it, and no amount of ritual can replace what was taken. Then I will give it what I can, Kaido said, and he walked toward the inner chamber with a determination that felt like it was being driven by something outside himself. Something that was older and stronger and more certain than his own will. And if that is not enough, then at least I will die trying to make things right. The grinding of bones grew louder, closer, and the shrine shook with a violence that sent cracks racing through the walls and dislodged tiles from the roof. Kaido opened the cabinet and took out the sacred objects, the whale bone whistle that had been carved by his great-grandfather, the prayer scrolls that had been copied by hand in generations past, the small containers of salt and sake that were the traditional offerings to the spirits of the sea. He arranged them on the altar with trembling hands, and he began to chant the words that he had learned as a child and had forgotten as an adult, the ancient prayers that were meant to guide the souls of the dead back to the deep, to give them rest and peace and the freedom to move on from the world of the living. But even as he chanted, even as he performed the gestures and offered the sacrifices, he knew that Tanaka was right. The Bake Kujira did not want a prayer. It wanted the marrow. And as the walls of the shrine began to collapse around him, as the ribs of the skeleton pierced the stone and reached into the sacred space with a hunger that was older than religion, Kaido understood that the price of peace was not something that could be paid with words or gestures, or the offerings of a man who had never truly believed in the power of the old ways. The price of peace was flesh. The price of peace was bone. The price of peace was the transformation of the living into the dead, of the human into the monument, of the village into the reef that would stand on the shore forever as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to repeat the sins of the past. The skeleton breathed in. Kaido felt it before he saw it. A suction that pulled at his body with a force that was not physical but spiritual, not gravitational but existential. It was as if the Bake Kujira had opened a mouth that was larger than the sky, larger than the world, and was drawing everything into the emptiness at its center. He felt his feet lift from the floor, felt his body being pulled toward the ribs that had pierced the shrine wall, felt the transformation that had been happening to his father accelerate in his own flesh, as the calcium-white hardness spread from his fingers up through his arms and into his chest. "No," he whispered, but the word was lost in the grinding of bones, and the rushing of air and the terrible, absolute silence that fell over the world as the Bake Kujira collected its due. And then there was only the white, the endless white of bone and calcium, and the eternal patience of the deep. The suction was absolute, a force that operated not on the body but on the essence, not on the flesh but on the soul. Kaido felt himself being pulled toward the Bake Kujira's ribs with a velocity that transcended physical movement, as if the distance between himself and the skeleton had become meaningless, as if space itself were contracting around the point of the whale's hunger. He tried to resist, to dig his heels into the stone floor of the shrine, to find some purchase that would anchor him against the pull, but his body was no longer responding to his will. The ossification had reached his legs, transforming muscle and tendon into rigid columns of calcium that would not bend or flex or do anything except maintain the posture of a man who had been caught in the act of falling. Around him, the other villagers were suffering the same fate. He could see them through the rain and the dust and the debris of the collapsing shrine, their bodies sliding across the wet stone toward the ribs that had pierced the walls, their faces frozen in expressions of silent terror that would never change, never soften, never find release in death, because death was not what the Bake Kujira offered. The transformation was claiming them all, the guilty and the innocent alike, the old and the young, the blind children who had been spared the sight of the skeleton but who could not escape its hunger, their small bodies being drawn toward the bones with the same inexorable pull that was consuming their parents and grandparents. Kaido reached for the altar, his fingers closing on the whale bone whistle that he had placed there only moments before, and he felt a surge of desperate hope that was almost as painful as the fear had been. The whistle was made from the bone of a whale, carved by his great-grandfather according to traditions that were older than the village itself, and it was meant to be used in the burial rites, to send the spirits of the dead back to the deep with a sound that was part music and part prayer and part command. If he could blow it, if he could produce the notes that were encoded in its hollow interior, perhaps he could reach the part of the Bake Kujira that was still whale, still animal, still capable of responding to the language of its own kind. He raised the whistle to his lips with hands that were already half transformed, the fingers stiffening into configurations that would not allow the subtle pressure changes required for proper embouchure. But he forced them to move, to bend, to violate the rigidity that was spreading through them like frost across a window, and he blew into the whistle with all the breath that remained in his lungs. The sound that emerged was not what he had expected. It was not the clear, piercing note that the burial rites demanded, not the summons that would guide a spirit to its rest. It was a wail, a moan, a cry of agony and despair that seemed to come not from the whistle, but from the bones themselves, from the marrow that still lingered in the hollow interior of the carved whale bone, from the memory of the animal that had died to provide the material from which the instrument was made. And the sound was answered. The Bake Kujira paused. The grinding of bones stopped. The suction that was pulling everything toward the skeleton's ribs faltered, stuttered, hesitated in a way that suggested confusion, uncertainty, the first crack in the absolute certainty of its purpose. The skull turned toward the shrine, the empty eye sockets fixing on Kaido with a gaze that was not physical but was nevertheless overwhelming in its intensity, and for a moment, a single heartbeat, a single breath, there was silence. Then the skeleton moved. Not toward Kaido as he had expected, but away, its massive form withdrawing from the shrine with a speed that was almost graceful, almost reverent. The ribs pulled free from the walls, the bones sliding through the stone without resistance, and the Bake Kujira retreated to the center of the village square, its body coiling in on itself like a snake preparing to strike, its skull lowering until it was level with the ground, its empty eyes fixed on Kaido with an expression that might have been curiosity, or might have been hunger, or might have been something that had no name in any human language. "It hears you," Tanaka whispered, and his voice was barely audible, barely human, the voice of a man who was more stone than flesh. "The whistle. It hears the whistle." Kaido blew again, and again the wail emerged, and again the Bake Kujira responded, its bones shivering with a vibration that traveled through the ground and into the bodies of the villagers, a sympathetic resonance that suggested recognition, understanding, perhaps even memory. The skeleton was listening. The skeleton was considering, and in that consideration there was the smallest possibility of mercy, the faintest hope that the debt could be paid in some currency other than the total annihilation of the village. But the hope was short-lived. As Kaido lowered the whistle, his breath exhausted and his lips numb with the cold of the transforming flesh, he saw the Bake Kujira's skull tilt, saw the jaw open in a gesture that was not roar but inhalation, and he understood with terrible clarity that the whale had made its decision. The whistle had bought them a moment, nothing more. The debt was still due, and the form of payment had been chosen. The skeleton breathed in. The suction returned, but it was different now, more focused, more selective. It was not pulling everything toward the center indiscriminately. It was choosing, sorting, selecting from among the villagers those who were most suitable for its purpose. And the criterion of selection was clear to Kaido even as he watched his neighbors being lifted from the ground and drawn toward the ribs. It was taking those who were most transformed, those whose ossification was most advanced, those who had already become part whale, part bone, part the thing that the Bake Kujira needed to make itself whole again. His father was the first to be taken. Kenji Nakamura's body, already more calcium than flesh, rose from the floor of the family home and floated through the rain toward the skeleton with a gentleness that was almost loving, almost maternal. The Bake Kujira's ribs parted to receive him, the bones opening like curtains to create a space within the framework where the transformed man could be positioned, integrated, made part of the whole. Kenji's body snapped into place between two vertebrae, his calcified limbs fusing with the whale's architecture in a way that suggested not violence but completion, not destruction but fulfillment. And as the fusion was completed, Kaido saw something change in the Bake Kujira's form, something subtle but unmistakable. A thickening of the bones, a gain in density, a step toward the wholeness that had been denied it for 20 years. "It's using them," Kaido whispered, and his voice was thick with horror and grief and the terrible understanding of what was happening. "It's using them to replace the flesh it lost. The ossification, it was preparing them. It was turning them into the right material, the right consistency, so that they could be integrated into the skeleton." "The fattening," Tanaka said, and his voice was resigned, accepting, the voice of a man who had finally understood the full scope of the trap that had been set for them. "The prosperity was not a gift, it was a process. The sea was feeding us, nourishing us, making us strong so that when the time came we would be worth taking. We are not victims, Kaido, we are harvest. We are crop. We are the yield of 20 years of careful cultivation, and the Bake Kujira is the farmer who has come to collect." The suction intensified, and more bodies were lifted from the ground, more villagers drawn into the ribs and fused with the architecture of the whale. Kaido watched as Mrs. Yamamoto, who had baked him birthday cakes when he was a child, was pulled from her collapsed house and snapped into place along the curve of a rib, her calcified body becoming part of the structure that had once been only bone. He watched as the village doctor, who had treated his childhood fevers and set his broken arm when he fell from a tree at age 7, was drawn into the space beneath the skull and positioned there like a guardian, a sentinel, a piece of living statuary that would stand forever in the empty eye socket of the whale. He watched as person after person, neighbor after neighbor, friend after friend, was collected and consumed and transformed into the building blocks of the Bake Kujira's renewed body. And he knew, with a certainty that went beyond fear into the territory of fatalistic acceptance, that his own turn was coming. The ossification was spreading faster now, accelerated by the proximity to the skeleton, by the resonance of the whale's hunger with the whale's mark that had been placed on him through his blood, his lineage, his connection to the man who had led the butchery. His legs were solid now, his arms stiffening, his torso becoming rigid with the same calcium-white hardness that had consumed his father. He could not run. He could not hide. He could only stand and watch and wait for the moment when the suction would lift him from the ground and carry him to his final integration. "There is no escape," he whispered, and the words were not despair but acknowledgement, not surrender but understanding. "There never was." "There is one escape," Tanaka said, and his voice was suddenly urgent, suddenly alive with a possibility that Kaido had not considered. The blind ones, the children, the whale skin protects them. The Bake Kujira cannot see them, cannot claim them, cannot integrate what it cannot perceive. If you cover your eyes, Kaido, if you blind yourself now before the transformation is complete. I can't, Kaido said, but his voice was uncertain, his resolve cracking under the weight of a hope that he had not dared to entertain. I can't blind myself. I can't. You must, Tanaka said, and his hands were moving, reaching for something in the debris of the shrine, something that Kaido could not see but that the old man had apparently been preparing for this moment. The whale skin. The old woman in the square, she had more. She gave me a piece in case someone needed it, in case there was someone worth saving. He pressed a scrap of rotting blubber into Kaido's hand, and the touch of it was cold and wet and impossibly heavy, as if the substance carried a mass that was not physical but spiritual, the concentrated essence of the whale's death and the village's guilt. Cover your eyes, Tanaka commanded. Cover them now before the suction takes you, before the transformation is complete. The Bake Kujira cannot claim what it cannot see. The debt is collected from those who look upon it, not from those who hide their faces in shame. Kaido looked at the scrap of whale skin in his hand, and then he looked at the skeleton, at the monstrous form that was consuming his village and his family and everything he had ever known, and he made his choice. He raised the blubber to his face and pressed it across his eyes, feeling the cold, rubbery texture mold itself to his features, feeling the rot and the salt and the impossible age of the substance seep into his pores, and he understood with perfect clarity that this was not escape. This was only postponement. This was only a temporary reprieve in a war that the sea would eventually win, because the sea always won, because the sea was older and more patient and more absolute than anything that walked on land. The suction reached him, pulled at him, lifted him from the ground with a gentleness that was almost loving. But as his body rose toward the ribs, toward the integration that awaited him, something changed. The Bake Kujira's skull tilted, the empty eye sockets scanning the space where Kaido had been, and the skeleton hesitated. It could not see him. The whale skin had rendered him invisible, untargetable, unclaimable. And after a moment that stretched into eternity, the skeleton moved on, releasing him from its pull, allowing him to fall back to the ground with a force that drove the air from his lungs and sent him tumbling across the wet stone of the shrine floor. He lay there, blinded by the whale skin, deafened by the grinding of bones and the screams of the villagers who were still being collected, and he felt the ossification slow, then stop, then begin to reverse in a way that was almost as painful as the transformation had been. The calcium was dissolving, melting, returning to the blood and the flesh from which it had been drawn, and Kaido understood that the mark of the whale was also its protection, that the same substance that had doomed the village could also save it, if only there were enough of it, if only there were time to apply it, if only the Bake Kujira could be convinced to stop its collection before there was no one left to save. But there was no time. Even as Kaido lay on the floor, recovering from his near death and planning how he might use his knowledge to save the others, the collection continued. The Bake Kujira moved through the village with a methodical precision that suggested not rage but purpose, not cruelty but necessity, taking what it needed from each house and each street and each trembling body that had not been protected by the whale skin. And when it was finished, when every suitable vessel had been claimed and integrated, the skeleton turned toward the harbor and began its retreat. The grinding of bones faded as the Bake Kujira moved back into the water, its massive form sinking beneath the surface with a gentleness that was almost graceful, almost grateful. The rain stopped. The clouds parted. The sun emerged from behind the retreating storm with a brightness that was obscene in its contrast to the devastation that lay beneath it. And on the shore of Ashima, where the village had once stood, there was now only silence. Kaido removed the whale skin from his eyes and looked around, and what he saw made him wish that he had kept the blubber in place, that he had chosen blindness over the sight of what remained. The village was gone. Not destroyed, not flattened, but transformed. The houses had become part of the landscape, their walls calcified into stone pillars that rose from the earth like the stalagmites of some impossible cave. The streets had become channels, filled with seawater that was already growing clear and still, reflecting the sky with a mirror-like perfection that suggested the surface of a lake rather than the aftermath of a storm. And everywhere, rising from the ground and the water and the ruins of the buildings, were the statues. They were calcium white, perfectly preserved, frozen in the attitudes of their final moments. Kaido could see Mrs. Yamamoto standing in her garden, her hands raised as if to ward off something that could not be warded off. He could see the village doctor kneeling beside his collapsed clinic, his face turned upward in an expression of prayer or supplication. He could see the hunters who had thrown their harpoons, their bodies caught mid-throw, their arms extended forever toward a target that had never been solid. And he could see his father, Kenji Nakamura, standing at the edge of the harbor with his face turned toward the sea, his body fully transformed into the same calcium-white stone that had consumed the rest of the village, his eyes open and aware and endlessly patient. They were not dead. That was the most terrible thing, the detail that Kaido's mind kept rejecting and returning to, as if it were a tongue probing a sore tooth. The villagers were not dead. They were conscious, aware, trapped in bodies that could not move and voices that could not speak, condemned to stand forever on the shore of the island that had been their home, watching the tide rise and fall with eyes that could not close and minds that could not stop thinking. They were a coral reef of human suffering, a monument to greed and guilt and the terrible justice of the sea, and they would remain here until the limestone crumbled and the ocean rose, and the last light faded from the last star in the last sky. Kaido walked through the ruins of the village, his feet sinking into the calcified earth with each step, his heart heavy with a grief that had no outlet and a guilt that had no absolution. He was the only one left, the only survivor, the only witness to the destruction of everything he had ever known. The children who had been blinded with whale skin were gone, carried away by parents who had not been so lucky, or perhaps taken by the Bake Kujira despite their protection, swallowed by the skeleton's hunger before it had learned to distinguish between the marked and the unmarked. There was no one to confirm their fate, no one to tell their story, no one except Kaido and the statues that watched him pass with eyes that were full of awareness and accusation, and the endless, unbearable patience of stone. He reached the harbor and stood at the edge of the water, looking out at the ocean that stretched to the horizon and beyond. The Bake Kujira was gone, returned to the deep with its new congregation of bone and flesh, its emptiness now filled by the bodies of the villagers who had been transformed into its framework. But Kaido could feel it still, could sense its presence in the water like a pressure against his skin, a weight against his chest, a knowledge that hummed in his bones with the same low-frequency vibration that had accompanied the skeleton's approach. It was still there, still waiting, still patient, and it knew him. It knew his face, his name, his blood. And someday, when the whale's skin rotted away and his eyes were exposed once more, it would come for him too. He turned away from the water and walked back through the village, past the statues that were his neighbors and his family and his entire history. And he found the road that led to the ferry terminal, the road that climbed into the interior of the island and away from the shore. He walked without looking back, without stopping, without allowing himself to feel anything except the mechanical determination to put distance between himself and the horror, to move forward because stopping meant remembering and remembering meant madness. The ferry was still at the terminal, its engines running, its crew apparently unaware of what had happened in the village only a few miles away. Kaido boarded it without speaking, without explaining, without doing anything except showing his ticket and finding a seat at the back of the cabin where he could watch the shore recede into the distance. The boat pulled away from the dock, and Kaido watched Ashima shrink behind them, the white pillars of the statues gleaming in the sun like the ribs of some impossible creature, like the bones of a whale that had finally found its rest. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. He did not report the disaster to the authorities, did not contact the newspapers, did not do anything that might draw attention to the village and its fate. What would he say? That a ghost whale had consumed his entire village and transformed it into a coral reef of living statues, that the sea collected debts in bone and marrow, that his father had been turned into stone and was even now standing on the shore, watching the horizon with eyes that could not close. They would call him mad. They would lock him away, and the truth would be lost, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and disbelief, and the comfortable assumption that the world was rational and predictable and safe. So he said nothing. He returned to Tokyo and resumed his life, or at least the outward appearance of it. He went back to the convenience store and the technical college, and the small apartment that smelled of ramen and loneliness. He slept through the noise of the city and woke to the gray light of mornings that had no meaning and evenings that had no hope. And every night when he closed his eyes, he saw the statues. He saw his father standing at the edge of the harbor, watching the sea with eyes that were full of awareness and regret. He saw Mrs. Yamamoto in her garden, her hands raised forever in a gesture of defense that had failed. He saw the village doctor kneeling in prayer, his face turned toward a heaven that had not answered. And he saw the Bake Kujira, swimming through the darkness of his dreams with a grace that was terrible and beautiful and absolutely certain of its eventual return. Years passed. The memory of Ashima faded from the maps and the guidebooks, and the minds of the people who had once known it as a prosperous fishing village with excellent seafood and beautiful sunsets. Travelers who passed by the shore saw only a strange, beautiful coral reef of white stone pillars emerging from the water, and they took photographs and marveled at the natural wonder, without ever understanding that the pillars were not coral, not stone, but the calcified remains of human beings who had once laughed and loved and dreamed of futures that would never come. And Kaito grew old. He grew old in his small apartment, surrounded by the noise of a city that had never known the sea, and he waited for the day when the whale's skin would finally rot away, and his eyes would be exposed once more, when the Bake Kujira would sense his presence and return to collect the last of the debt. He knew it was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the same low-frequency vibration that had been his companion since that terrible night, growing stronger with each passing year, each passing decade, each passing century of the whale's patient hunger. But that day was not today. Today, Kaito was alive, and the sun was warm on his face, and the city was full of people who had never heard of Ashima or the Bake Kujira or the terrible price of prosperity. He walked through the streets with his camera in his pocket, taking photographs of things that were ordinary and beautiful and entirely free of the taint of the deep. And he tried to forget that somewhere beneath the waves, a skeleton swam with a congregation of bone and flesh, waiting for the tide to turn and the debt to come due again. The ferry ride was a passage through a nightmare that Kaito could not wake from. He sat at the back of the cabin, his hands pressed against his face, feeling the whale's skin where it still adhered to his eyes, the cold, rubbery texture that had become a part of him now, that he could no more remove than he could remove his own eyelids. The other passengers, there were only 3, an old woman and 2 fishermen returning from a delivery, looked at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern, to the carefully maintained indifference of people who have learned not to ask questions about things that do not concern them. Kaito kept his face turned toward the window, toward the receding shore of Ashima that was already becoming a memory, already becoming a story that he would tell himself in the dark hours of the night and never repeat to another living soul. The whale's skin smelled. It was a smell that he had not noticed at first, in the chaos of the shrine and the terror of the skeleton's collection, but now, in the enclosed space of the ferry cabin, he could not escape it. It was the smell of the deep, of pressure and darkness and the slow decomposition of organic matter in an environment where oxygen was a luxury and time moved differently. It was the smell of the whale's death, concentrated and preserved, a chemical signature that announced to anyone with the nose to detect it that the wearer had been marked by something that did not belong to the world of the living. Kaido felt the other passengers shifting in their seats, felt their nostrils flaring, felt the unconscious recoil of bodies that recognized danger even when their minds could not name it. He kept his face pressed against the glass, watching the island shrink until it was only a smudge on the horizon, a blur of green and white that might have been forest and might have been bone, and he felt something crack inside him, some dam that had held back the flood of grief and horror and guilt since the moment he had stepped off the train and seen the village waiting for him with its wrong prosperity and its sewn mouths, and its children blinded by rotting blubber. The tears came then, hot and silent, running down his face and mixing with the residue of the whale's skin until his cheeks were streaked with a fluid that was not quite salt water and not quite mucus, but something that belonged to the same family of substances, something that carried the same chemical signature of the deep. He did not make a sound. He had learned, in the hours since his return, that sound was dangerous, that the sea collected debts from those who spoke as well as those who looked. That silence was the only protection available to a man who had witnessed the impossible and survived. So he wept without noise, his body shaking with the force of the grief that was consuming him, his hands pressed against his face to hide the evidence of his breakdown from the other passengers who were already edging away from him, already preparing to disembark at the next stop and tell their friends about the strange young man who smelled of death and wept without making a sound. The ferry docked at the mainland terminal in the late afternoon, and Kaido stumbled off with the mechanical compliance of a man who has forgotten how to make decisions, who has surrendered his will to the momentum of events, and is simply allowing himself to be carried along by the current of circumstance. He found a bathroom and stood before the mirror, and what he saw made him recoil from his own reflection, made him want to smash the glass and hide the pieces so that he would never have to look at himself again. The whale's skin had begun to integrate with his face. It was no longer merely adhered to his skin. It was becoming his skin, the boundary between the rotting blubber and his own living tissue dissolving with a speed that suggested not infection but symbiosis, not disease but design. The edges of the skin had grown tendrils, fine filaments that had burrowed into his pores and wrapped around his facial nerves, and when he touched the surface with trembling fingers, he could feel sensation in the blubber, could feel the pressure of his touch as if the whale's skin were a part of his body that had always been there, that had merely been waiting for the right conditions to emerge. He washed his face with water that was too hot and soap that was too strong, scrubbing at the skin with a violence that made his face raw and bleeding, but the whale's skin remained, unmoved, unyielding, patient. It had claimed him, marked him, made him a part of its own biological system, and no amount of mechanical abrasion could remove what had become a component of his own body. He was, in some sense that he could not yet fully articulate, becoming the whale, or the whale was becoming him. The distinction no longer seemed to matter. He bought a ticket for Tokyo and boarded the train, finding a seat in the corner of an empty car where he could press his face against the window and watch the countryside blur past in a smear of green and gray and brown. The cities rose around him, concrete and steel and glass, and he felt a faint stirring of something that might have been hope, might have been despair, might have been the simple animal gratitude of a creature that has found shelter from a storm. The city did not know about whales. The city did not remember debts. The city was a place where the sea was a rumor and the old ways were superstition, and the only thing that mattered was the present moment, the next transaction, the immediate satisfaction of desire. But even in the city, the vibration followed him. It was weaker here, attenuated by distance and concrete, and the electromagnetic noise of millions of electronic devices, but it was still present, still humming in his bones with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of something vast and patient, and absolutely certain of its eventual victory. He could feel it when he lay down to sleep, a pressure against his sternum that made it difficult to breathe, a weight against his consciousness that made it impossible to dream of anything except the sea. He could feel it when he walked through the crowded streets, a loneliness that was deeper than the absence of company, a solitude that came from being the only person in the world who knew the truth about what waited beneath the waves. Years passed, and the whale's skin did not rot. It should have rotted. Organic matter exposed to air and bacteria, and the ordinary processes of decomposition should have broken down within weeks, within months at most. But the whale skin on Kaito's face remained intact, preserved by some property that he could not identify, some chemical or biological mechanism that kept it fresh and functional and absolutely determined to maintain its grip on his features. He learned to live with it, to wear sunglasses and hats and the masks that became fashionable during the pandemic, to hide his face from the world in ways that seemed eccentric but not insane, strange but not dangerous. And every year, on the anniversary of the destruction of Ashima, he would take the train to the coast and stand on the shore and feel the vibration strengthen, feel the presence of the Bake Kujira grow closer and more immediate until it seemed to be swimming just beneath the surface of the water, waiting for him to wade in and surrender himself to the debt that he had never incurred but could never escape. He would stand there for hours, sometimes all night, feeling the tide rise and fall around his ankles and the whale skin pulse against his face with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the deep. And in the morning, he would return to the city, to his small apartment and his meaningless job and his life that was nothing more than a postponement of the inevitable. The ocean did not forget. The ocean did not forgive. And the ocean, which was older than sin and more patient than death, would always find a way to collect what was owed. In the calcium-white statue that had been Kenji Nakamura, the consciousness that remained watched and waited and endured, feeling the tide rise and fall around his stone ankles, feeling the sun and the rain and the slow erosion of wind against his face, feeling everything except the ability to move, to speak, to end the suffering that was his reward for leading the butchery that had destroyed everything he loved. He was not alone. The other villagers were with him, their minds joined in a network of calcium and consciousness that hummed with the same low-frequency vibration as the whale itself, their thoughts blending together into a single chorus of regret and longing, and the endless, unbearable hope that someday, somehow, the debt would be paid and they would find rest. But rest was a long way away. The debt was not yet paid. The Bake Kujira still swam, still hungered, still searched the depths for the last of the marrow that had been stolen from it. And as long as Kaito lived, as long as the whale skin protected his eyes and the vibration hummed in his bones, the cycle would continue, the story would repeat, and the sea would continue to teach its terrible lessons to anyone foolish enough to believe that the old ways were superstition and the whales were just meat. The tide turned, the sun set, the stars emerged in a sky that was empty of everything except the endless darkness of space and the patient, eternal heartbeat of the deep. And on the shore of Ashima, where no village remained and no human voice had spoken in decades, the statues stood in their perfect white ranks, watching the horizon with eyes that could not close, waiting for the return of the skeleton that had claimed them and the release that would never come. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle lap of waves against stone and the distant cry of a single gull, circling overhead in a world that had moved on, that had forgotten, that would never remember the village of Ashima or the man who had returned to it too late to save anyone, including himself. And in the darkness beneath the waves, the Bake Kujira smiled with a mouth that was full of teeth and memory and the absolute certainty that all debts, eventually, would be collected. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come.